What if Ned Stark told Jon the truth? Not at 18, not on his deathbed. When Jon was 5 years old, everything you know about Jon Snow, the doubt, the shame, the not knowing, gone. Replaced by something the Targaryens haven't had in 100 years. A dragon who knew exactly what he was. This is what happens next.
Chapter 1. The Dragon's Bastard Winterfell, 291 AC. Jon is 5 years old. The first thing Jon Snow ever learned about dragons was that they were dead. He was 5 years old when he learned this, sitting cross-legged on a stone floor in Maester Luwin's tower while a candle melted itself into a puddle of tallow beside him. He had climbed up here because Robb and Theon were playing a game that involved shouting, and Jon did not feel like shouting that afternoon. He felt like sitting very still and thinking about things, which was a habit that already worried the servants. The dragon in the book was enormous, a creature of scales and smoke and wild amber eyes, rendered in faded ink by some long-dead maester who had clearly never seen one up close and was mostly guessing. Jon studied it for a long time. "Maester Luwin," he said without looking up. "Where do dragons come from?" Luwin, who was sorting through a pile of Raven's scrolls and had been hoping for a quiet afternoon himself, peered over his spectacles. "Old Valyria originally, though the Targaryens brought them west. Are there any left?" A pause. "3, it is said, across the sea." Jon looked up at that. "Whose?" Luwin set down his scrolls. This, he had known, would come eventually, he just hadn't expected it at 5. "A girl named Daenerys Targaryen," he said carefully, "and her brother Viserys, they live in exile." Jon considered this. Then, with the particular directness of small children and very old men, "Targaryen, that's my father's name, isn't it?" The maester went very still. "Luwin." The voice came from the doorway. Lord Eddard Stark stood in the entrance of the tower, still wearing his riding cloak and smelling of horse and autumn wind. He had arrived from the yard 5 minutes ago and had taken the stairs 2 at a time, which was not something Ned Stark normally did. His expression was the careful one, the one that meant he was thinking about 4 things at once and showing none of them. "Leave us, please." Luwin left with the grateful speed of a man who had just been rescued. Ned sat on the floor. This surprised Jon enormously. Lords did not sit on floors. Robb had told him so with great authority. Lords sat on chairs or benches or thrones, and if none of those were available, they stood, because standing was also acceptably lordly. Floors were for dogs and small children. And yet here was Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North, sitting on the cold stone floor of Maester Luwin's tower with his long legs folded awkwardly, looking at Jon the way Jon sometimes looked at things he wasn't sure how to pick up. "You heard what Luwin said," Ned said. It was not a question. He said Targaryen, that's the same as, "Yes," Ned exhaled slowly. "It is." Jon waited. He was very good at waiting. Robb said it was unnerving, and Theon said it was creepy, and Sansa said it was rude. But Jon had found that if you waited long enough, adults usually told you the thing they were going to tell you anyway, and you saved a lot of time by not asking 17 questions first. Ned looked at the candle. Looked at the book, looked at Jon. "Your father," he said, "was a prince. His name was Rhaegar Targaryen. He was the crown prince of the 7 kingdoms, and he died before you were born." Jon processed this. "How did he die?" "He was killed in battle, at a place called the Trident." "Who killed him?" A very long pause. "King Robert Baratheon." Jon looked at the picture of the dragon in the book. He thought about the king, who he had never met but who Robb spoke of with excitement, the great warrior king, the man who won the realm. He thought about what it meant that this man had killed his father. "Is he a bad man?" Jon asked. Ned opened his mouth, closed it. Ned Stark, who was constitutionally incapable of lying to a child's face, stared at the candle for a very long time. "He is a complicated man," Ned finally said. "Who did what he believed was right." Jon had been around adults long enough to know that complicated was the word they used when the real answer was too much for a Tuesday afternoon. "You said he's the king," Jon said. "Does the king know about me?" "No." Ned's voice went quiet and very serious. "Jon, listen to me carefully. The king does not know you exist, and it is very important that he does not find out. Do you understand?" Jon understood the shape of what he was being told, if not all the details. He was 5, not stupid. His father had been a prince, and the king had killed his father, and the king did not know he existed, and Ned Stark, who was not his father, was keeping him safe in Winterfell, and all of this was a secret. "Who was my mother?" Jon asked. Something moved across Ned's face. "A wound, poorly healed." Someone I loved very much, he said. I will tell you more when you are older. John accepted this. He would have to. He looked at the dragon in the book for a long moment, then closed it carefully and handed it to Ned. Okay, he said. Ned blinked. Okay, I won't tell anyone. John stood up and dusted off his breeches with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided this conversation was finished. Can I go play now? Rob and Theon stopped shouting. Ned stared at him for a moment, then, despite everything, he laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, and it faded quickly, but it was real. Yes, he said. Go play. John was halfway to the door when he stopped. He turned around. Ned, he said. He had started calling him Ned recently rather than father, a change that none of the servants had commented on, perhaps because they could see it was not done with malice. Thank you for telling me. Ned looked at him for a long moment. Something complicated moved through his eyes. Your mother made me promise, he said. I kept that promise poorly. I should have told you sooner. John nodded once like a small, serious judge. Then he ran down the stairs. Ned sat on the floor a while longer. Outside, he heard the sound of two boys shouting, which meant Theon had started again. Winterfell 293 AC. Jon is 7. The lie was not complicated. It was just Jon Snow, Ned Stark's ward. Not his son, not his blood, a ward. Vague enough to be unremarkable in a world full of bastards and orphans and children handed off for political reasons. The people of Winterfell did not ask too many questions, because they had worked out some of the shape of it on their own. The stark gray eyes Jon did not have. The dark coloring slightly too dark for a true Northman. The stillness that did not come from Eddard, Stark's famously brooding but ultimately readable face. They had drawn their own conclusions, which were wrong, and Ned did not correct them. Catelyn Tully Stark did not like any version of this arrangement. She was a fair woman. Jon could recognize this in the way that children can sometimes see around their own grievances to the underlying truth, and she did not hate him. What she felt was more complicated and more uncomfortable than hate. She felt as though there was a piece in the game that did not belong to the board she was playing on, and she could not remove it, and it bothered her the way a splinter bothers a finger. She was also, Jon had noticed, very careful never to be actively unkind to him when Ned could see. Which told him something about both of them. Robb knew not all of it, not the Targaryen part. But Robb was 9 and sharp and had the Tully blue eyes that missed nothing, and one afternoon while they were chasing each other around the Godswood he'd said, breathlessly, mid-sprint, Maester Luwin says you're not really a bastard, you know. He says there's no such thing as a ward who's treated like family if they're just a ward. Jon had tripped over a root and gone face first into the snow. Oh, he said, eloquently. Robb had helped him up. I don't care, you know, what you are. You're my brother. He said it in the tone of someone issuing a legal declaration, the way he'd once declared that the East Tower was their tower and nobody else's. Final, non-negotiable. Jon had snow in his mouth and a scraped knee, and something warm was happening in his chest that he didn't know what to do with. You're my brother too, he said, spitting out snow, and that was that. Robb Stark had decided Jon was his brother, and the universe was expected to adjust accordingly, which it mostly did. The ghost arrived in winter, which was when things that mattered tended to arrive in the north. He was white as fresh snow and silent as snowfall, and he came to Jon specifically, walked past Robb's pup and Sansa's lady and little Arya's Nymeria and all the others, and sat down in front of Jon with the deliberate air of an animal that has been looking for someone and has now found them. Jon named him Ghost because he made no sound. He was also, within 2 weeks, nearly twice the size of the other direwolves, which Theon Greyjoy pointed out with an air of someone hoping for drama. Nobody could explain it. Luwin suggested it was a matter of feeding. Robb pointed out that all the direwolves were fed the same things. Old Nan said it was because the wolf knew something. What does he know? Jon asked her. Old Nan smiled her ancient knowing smile. That you are more than you look, boy. Jon considered this. All people are more than they look. Said Old Nan, but most of them don't have a wolf to prove it. Ghost looked at Jon. Jon looked at Ghost. There was an understanding between them that required no words, which was convenient because Ghost never provided any. In the quiet of that first winter night, with the wolf's warm weight against his side and the fire burning low, Jon lay awake and thought about dragons. About a man who had died at the Trident, whom he had never met and never would. About a mother whose name he did not yet know. He was 7 years old and he did not cry. He had already decided, somewhere in the wordless logic of childhood, that crying about his parents was like crying about the weather. The feeling was real, but the target was wrong. What he felt instead was something closer to curiosity. A deep, patient, slightly dangerous curiosity, like a door he could see at the end of a long corridor waiting to be opened. Ghost put his large white head on John's chest and exhaled. "I know," John told him. "I'm thinking." Ghost closed his eyes, unbothered. He could wait. Winterfell, 295 AC. Jon is 9 by the time he was 9. Jon Snow was the best swordsman in his age group in Winterfell by such a comfortable margin that it had stopped being interesting to everyone except Sir Roderick Castle, who found it professionally fascinating. "Again," said Roderick, walking around the sparring circle with his hands behind his back and his famous white whiskers twitching. "And this time, Snow, try not to disarm your opponent quite so quickly. Robb needs to at least feel like he has a chance." "I let him go 3 exchanges before," Jon said. The future Lord of Winterfell would like more than 3 exchanges. Robb, who was picking up his wooden sword from the mud with great dignity, pointed the sword at Jon. "I wasn't ready that time." "You said that the last 4 times," Jon said without malice. "I wasn't ready those times either." Theon, watching from the fence with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who has decided that the world owes them more amusement than it provides, said, "The ward hits harder than the air. Very stark of you, Robb." "Shut up, Theon." "I'm just saying, shut up, Theon." Jon lowered his sword and waited for them to finish. This was another habit that people found either admirable or irritating depending on their temperament. Jon rarely stepped into arguments that weren't about him. When they were about him, he tended to say one thing clearly and then stop talking, because he had noticed that saying more rarely helped and usually made things worse. After training, Sir Roderick pulled him aside. "You're holding back," the old knight said, "not an accusation, an observation." Jon looked at him steadily. "I always hold back." Roderick was quiet for a moment. He was one of the people in Winterfell who had been there long enough to have seen things and to have kept his thoughts about those things to himself, which Jon respected. "Why?" Jon considered several answers. He chose the honest one. "Because I don't want them to ask why." Roderick looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded once slowly and walked away. He never asked again. He just made the training harder. Winterfell, 297 AC. Jon is 11. The dreams started when he was 11. They were not frightening, exactly. They were strange in the way that things were strange when they were too real to be comfortable, the opposite of nightmares, which were clearly unreal and therefore easy to dismiss in daylight. These dreams insisted on themselves, fire mostly. He was never in the fire. He was always watching it from some middle distance, a great column of flame, warm and not terrible, and the sound of enormous wings. Sometimes there was music, a harp he could hear but never quite locate. And sometimes, at the very edge of the dream where the details went blurry, there was the shape of a man, tall with silver hair, who turned toward him but whose face Jon could never see before he woke. He told no one. This was not difficult. He had become very good at keeping things inside himself by 11. Not in the wounded, festering way, but in the way of someone who has decided that some things are too fragile to survive the handling. He went back to Lewin's Tower instead. He had developed, over 6 years, a thorough and covert education in the history of House Targaryen. He read carefully, methodically, the way Ned had taught him to approach anything worth understanding. He read about Aegon the Conqueror and his sister wives. He read about the Dance of Dragons and the civil war that nearly destroyed the house. He read about Daeron the young dragon and Baelor the Blessed and the Mad King, who burned men alive and whose name made even Ned's jaw go tight, and he read about Rhaegar. There was not much. The histories of the realm had been written mostly by men who served Robert Baratheon now, and they were not inclined to be generous. But the shape of him emerged from the margins of other accounts, a prince who had been expected to be a warrior and became a scholar instead, then forced himself back into a warrior anyway. A man who played the harp so beautifully that people wept without knowing why. A man who had been obsessed with a prophecy he believed referred to himself, and who had made choices on the basis of that prophecy that had cost thousands of lives. Jon read the last part several times. He thought, "He sounds like a man who was very sure he was right." He thought, "I wonder if he was." He thought, "I wonder if I would have liked him." He returned the histories to their shelves in the careful order he'd found them, so that Lewin would not notice they'd been moved. Ghost was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs, white as a verdict. "Well," Jon said to the wolf. Ghost tilted his massive head. My father believed he was the prince that was promised, the hero of a prophecy. John stopped. He was also the man who started a war that killed thousands of people. Ghost considered this. I don't think those two things are contradictions, John said. I think that's the problem. Ghost sneezed. Right, John said. Come on, supper. They walked back across the yard, boy and wolf, the cold settling around them like a cloak. The stars were coming out over the walls of Winterfell, sharp and bright and impossibly far away. John thought about dragons. About fire. About a man with silver hair whose face he could not see. He thought, I will not make decisions based on certainty I do not have. He thought, I will find out what is true before I act on it. He was 11 years old, and he had already decided the one thing that would define him above everything else. Not his blood, not his name, not his dragon or his sword or the throne that did not know his name yet. He had decided to look before he leaped. It was, in the long run, the most revolutionary thing a Targaryen had done in 300 years. Chapter 2. A Prince in Grey Furs. Winterfell, 298 AC. Jon is 13. The king arrived on a Tuesday, which Jon would later decide was appropriate because nothing catastrophic ever happened on a dignified day. Catastrophes were Tuesdays. Small personal disasters were Thursdays. True tragedy, the kind that changed the shape of your life, always announced itself on an otherwise ordinary morning when you had planned to do something else entirely. Jon had planned to spend the morning at the armory. Instead, he was standing in the courtyard of Winterfell in his best clothes, which were Robb's second best clothes, made over, a fact Theon had already mentioned twice. Watching the longest procession of horses and wagons and knights and servants and banners he had ever seen in his life come rattling through the gates. How many people does a king need to travel? He asked Robb quietly. All of them, apparently. Robb said also quietly, also impressed despite himself. Theon says there's 500 in the party. Theon also said there was a bear in the Wolfswood last autumn. There was a bear. Theon said it was the size of a house. It was a large bear. It was a medium-sized bear, Robb. I saw it. Robb considered this. 500 is probably an exaggeration. It was not much of an exaggeration. The Baratheon procession filled the yard and then kept filling it, like a pot that someone had overfilled and left on the heat. There were knights with gleaming armor that had clearly never been used in actual combat. There were ladies in silks wholly unsuited to the north, already regretting their life choices. There were wagons of supplies, and cages of hounds, and a wheelhouse the size of a small house that groaned on its axles like it was philosophically opposed to the concept of travel. And at the center of it all, on the largest horse Jon had ever seen, Robert Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. He was enormous. Not tall, though he was tall, but enormous in the way that certain people are enormous, as though they take up more space than their body technically requires. He had a black beard going to gray and a booming laugh that Jon could hear from 30 feet away, and he swung off his horse with the confidence of a man who had never once in his life considered that a horse might not want to be swung off. He embraced Ned with the force of a small avalanche. Jon watched this. He watched Ned, controlled, reserved Ned Stark, who expressed affection through occasionally touching people on the shoulder, get picked up slightly off the ground by a king. He watched Ned's face over Robert's shoulder, the complicated mix of genuine warmth and deep, old grief and something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. He watched the king laugh. This, Jon thought, is the man who killed my father. He held the thought at a careful distance and examined it, the way you'd examine something that might bite. The king did not look like a villain. He looked like a man who had once been exceptional and was now working very hard on becoming comfortable. He looked like someone Jon might have liked in a different world, in a different story. This was deeply inconvenient information, and Jon filed it away. Jon Snow. Ned was bringing the king along the line of children. Jon had one moment to prepare his face, which was enough, because he had been preparing this particular face since he was 5 years old. The face that said, I am nobody of significance. I am a ward. I am a background detail in someone else's story. Please look at Robb instead. He's the interesting one, my ward, Ned said. His voice was perfectly level. Jon had always admired this about him. He has been with us since his birth. Robert Baratheon looked at Jon. Jon looked back. The king had dark eyes, heavy under thick brows, and they moved over Jon's face the way a man's eyes move when he's searching for something he can't name. Jon kept his breathing steady. He thought about gray stones. He thought about still water. He thought about Lewin once telling him that the secret to a good poker face was not controlling your expression but genuinely not caring, and he had spent years practicing not caring about the things he cared about most. "Ward," Robert said. He said it the way a man says a word he's heard before but isn't quite sure he believes. "Who's?" "A friend's," Ned said. "Long dead." The king looked at Jon a moment longer. Something moved behind his eyes, not recognition, not quite, but the approach of recognition, the way you can feel thunder before you hear it. "Good-looking boy, something about the eyes." "He takes after his mother," Ned said immediately. "Aye, well." Robert moved on, pulled by the tide of his own procession, already laughing at something one of his knights had said. "Good lad, what do you say to a king, boy?" "Welcome to Winterfell, your grace," Jon said. He said it the way he'd been practicing in his head for 3 days. Warm enough to be polite, plain enough to be forgettable. A perfect nothing of a sentence from a perfect nothing of a ward. Robert waved a hand and moved on. Jon let out a breath. Beside him, Robb exhaled too, which meant he'd been holding it as well, which meant Ned had told him more than Jon had realized. Jon filed that away also. Ghost, who had been sitting very still behind Jon's left leg, at Jon's specific and firmly communicated request, let out a low breath and stood up to his full, considerable height. Several of the royal party's horses shied. Robert's own destrier rolled an eye. Robert looked at the direwolf with the first genuine expression of impressed surprise Jon had seen on his face since the king arrived. "Gods be good," Robert said. "That is a large wolf." "Yes," said Jon. "Whose is it?" "Mine, your grace." The king looked at the wolf looked at the king. Ghost had the particular quality of looking at people as though he could see things about them that they had forgotten to hide, and Robert Baratheon shifted slightly in a way that had probably not happened to him in 30 years. "Friendly?" Robert asked. "To me," Jon said. Another pause. Then Robert laughed, loud and sudden, and moved on. Jon looked down at Ghost. "Good," he said quietly. Ghost sat back down with the air of someone who had done a job and expected acknowledgement. 3 days later, the prince was 13 and already magnificent at being awful. Jon had observed Joffrey Baratheon for 3 days with the detached analytical interest of someone cataloging a natural phenomenon. The boy was beautiful in the way that certain poisonous things were beautiful. It was almost part of the design, a trap. He had his mother's cheekbones and his father's size and the temperament of a cat that had never once been told no. He also, Jon noted, held his sword wrong. The sparring session in the yard had been Robb's suggestion, made in good faith, which was how most of Robb's social disasters began. Robb had the Stark instinct for hospitality and none of the Stark instinct for self-preservation, and he had thought it would be a good idea to invite the prince to spar, to make him feel welcome, to show northern courtesy. That was a mistake. Theon observed from the fence, watching Joffrey make a young stable boy hold his water cup. "He asked to spar," Robb said, with the slightly baffled expression of someone who had not intended to start something and was now committed to finishing it. "He asked for Robb to spar," Theon said. "He's been looking at Jon like he's a piece of mud since he arrived," Jon had noticed. He had not said anything about it, because saying things about it would have required caring, and caring would have required explaining why it bothered him. And explaining that would have been a complicated conversation he did not want to have in a busy yard full of royal knights. Joffrey sauntered up with his sword and his 2 Kingsguard shadows and looked at Jon the way a cat looks at something it is considering whether to bother with. "The ward," he said, "not a greeting, a classification." "Your grace," Jon said, which was accurate and said nothing. "Do you know who I am?" Jon considered several responses and selected the most boring one. "The Crown Prince of the 7 Kingdoms, your grace." "Then you'll know to yield when I tell you to." Robb made a small sound. Jon put his hand on Robb's arm once, lightly, which was the signal they'd developed over years that meant, "I have this, please do not help me, your help will make it worse." "Of course, your grace," Jon said pleasantly. What followed was not, technically, a fair fight. Jon was 13 and Joffrey was 13. But Jon had been training with Sir Roderick for years under the quiet but relentless instruction of a man who believed that if you were going to learn a thing, you should learn it properly or not bother. Joffrey had been trained by Kingsguard who were, it became apparent within 6 seconds, very careful never to make the prince feel bad about losing. Jon was not a Kingsguard. He also was, as he had told Sir Roderick, very good at holding back. He went 3 exchanges. The prince was not without skill, and Jon acknowledged this privately, and then he disarmed Joffrey on the 4th with a clean twist of the wrist that sent the prince's sword spinning into the mud 3 feet away. Dead silence in the yard. Joffrey looked at his empty hand. Looked at his sword in the mud. Looked at Jon with an expression that went through surprise and landed somewhere much darker. Again, he said. Jon retrieved the prince's sword courteously and handed it back. They went again. Jon let him go 5 exchanges this time, found an opening on the 6th, and put the sword in the mud again. The silence this time had a different quality. One of the Kingsguards, Sir Meryn Trant, who had the look of a man who beat people for a living and enjoyed it, put his hand on his own sword hilt. Not drawing, just reminding. Jon looked at the Kingsguard, looked at the sword hilt, looked back at Joffrey. He could see very clearly the shape of the room he was in. He was a ward with no name and no position who had just embarrassed the crown prince twice in front of witnesses, and one of the Kingsguard was reminding him that embarrassments could be answered in multiple ways. This was the kind of situation that ended badly for people who did not know when to stop. Jon took a step back and lowered his sword. "Your Grace fights well," he said with absolute composure. "I had the better footing both times, the yards uneven near the gate." Joffrey stared at him. His ears were red. He knew, with the sharp animal intelligence that cruel people often had, that he was being managed, that this graceful offer of an excuse was not respect but something more complicated and more insulting than open disrespect. He could not prove it. He could not call Jon a liar without calling the explanation a lie, which would mean admitting the yard was level, which would mean admitting he'd lost. "Yes," Joffrey said tightly. "The footing." He walked away. Trant followed, giving Jon a look that meant something. Jon met it without expression. Robb appeared at his elbow. "The footing," he said. "The footing," Jon agreed. "The yard is completely flat." "I know, Theon, from the fence. That was either very clever or very stupid." "Probably both," Jon said. He picked up his own sword and went to clean it. Ghost fell into step beside him, and Jon put his hand briefly on the wolf's enormous head and thought, that could have gone worse. He did not add, and it may yet. He heard them through the door of Ned's solar. He had not meant to. He had come to ask Ned something about the training schedule, a legitimate errand, and had stopped because the voices were quiet in the particular way that meant serious, and something in his gut had said, "Wait." He waited. The king noticed him. Catelyn's voice. Controlled, but underneath the control, something tightly wound. Robert looked at him and looked again. "Ned," he said. There was something about the boy's eyes. Robert was drunk. Robert is always drunk. He still sees. That's what makes him dangerous. A pause. "What happens if he finds out?" Ned said nothing. "Ned, he won't. But if he did?" Catelyn's voice dropped lower, and Jon had to hold very still to catch it. "If he found out what Jon is, what would Robert do?" The silence that followed was its own answer. Jon already knew the answer. He had known it since he was 5. In the abstract, logical way he knew most things. But hearing the silence where the words should have been made it different, made it real in his body rather than just in his head. "He would kill him," Catelyn said, not cruelly, just the facts laid out. "He would have no choice. A living Targaryen heir." "Jon is not." Ned stopped, started again. "Jon's claim is not public. There is no documentation. There are no witnesses who would speak. Howland Reed." Howland would die before he spoke. "Men die in various ways, some of them not of their choosing." Another silence. "The boy needs to leave Winterfell," Catelyn said, and her voice had the careful flatness of someone proposing something they know will not go well. "When Robert leaves, send him somewhere, the Citadel, somewhere far." "No," Ned's voice went hard in the way it rarely did. "I will not send him away. I promised." "You promised a dead woman." "I promised my sister." The words landed like stones. "And I will keep that promise until I am in the ground. We are finished discussing this, Catelyn." Jon stepped back from the door. He walked back down the corridor. He went to the Godswood because it was quiet and private, and there was no one there to watch his face. He sat by the black pool under the heart tree and looked at his own reflection in the dark water. He did not feel afraid. He thought he probably should, and noted the absence with interest. What he felt was something colder and more clarifying than fear, the recognition of a fact he had known in theory but had just been handed in practice. He was, in the most literal sense, a boy who could be killed by the king for the crime of existing. His safety rested entirely on Ned Stark's silence and the ignorance of powerful men. This was not an acceptable long-term arrangement. He did not know yet what the acceptable long-term arrangement looked like. He was 13. He had limited options and no power and a name that he couldn't actually use in public. What he had was time and a mind that had been quietly working on problems since he was 5 years old, and the beginning of an idea that he could not have articulated yet. But that sat in the back of his head with the patient certainty of something that intends to be important. He needed to not be a secret. He needed to be, eventually, something that could not simply be quietly killed because the king didn't know about it. He didn't know how. Not yet. But he had decided, sitting by the black pool with the faces of the old gods watching from the bark of the weirwood, that he was going to find out. Ghost came and sat beside him. The wolf's white fur reflected in the dark water, a ghost of a ghost. "I need to be ready," Jon told him, "for something." "I don't know what yet." Ghost put his chin on Jon's knee. "I know," Jon said. "I don't like not knowing either." The night before the king leaves, he went back to Lewin's library that night. He had a specific purpose this time, not the general Targaryen histories, but one particular topic that he had been circling around for months without quite looking at directly. He found the scroll he wanted in the third drawer of the second cabinet. A Meister's account of the year of the false spring, 281 AC, and the tournament at Harrenhal. He read about the tournament. He read about how Rhaegar Targaryen, the crown prince, the greatest knight of his age, the man who could have won any prize he chose, had won the tournament's joust. And how, instead of crowning his own wife with the victor's wreath of winter roses, he had ridden past her and past all the high-born ladies of the court and placed the roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark. Lyanna Stark. His mother. Jon sat very still for a long time. He had known for 2 years that his mother was Ned's sister. He had not known the shape of the story that connected her to Rhaegar. He had deliberately not assumed, actually, he had deliberately not thought about it too hard, because he had suspected the truth was complicated. He had suspected and been right. He read on. He read how Rhaegar had crowned Lyanna in front of 10,000 witnesses and the entire court, including his own wife, the Dornish princess Elia Martell. He read how the realm had taken it as an open declaration. He read what came after, the elopement or the abduction. The histories did not agree on which, and Jon noticed this disagreement and filed it away as important. He read about Lyanna's brother Brandon riding to King's Landing in fury and being burned alive by the Mad King. He read about her father meeting the same fate. He read about Ned's father, Jon's grandfather, and felt something cold move through him. He read about the war. He put the scroll down. He was 13 years old, sitting alone in a library at midnight with a candle burning low, and he had just read the story that had produced him. A tournament. A crown of winter roses. A choice that a prince made in public that changed everything, and whatever his reasons were, love, prophecy, madness, calculation, all of the above, thousands of people had died for it, including his parents. Including his uncle and grandfather, whom Ned had never spoken of but whose loss Jon could see sometimes in the set of Ned's jaw. Jon thought about what kind of man made that choice. He thought, a man who was certain, a man who believed he was right. A man who put his own certainty above every other consideration, including the lives of the people his certainty would cost, he thought. That is the most dangerous kind of man there is, he thought. I am his son. He let that sit for a while. The candle dripped. Somewhere in the castle, he heard distant laughter, the king's party, still celebrating something, as they had been celebrating every night since they arrived. Then Jon did something that none of the accounts would have predicted, based on what they thought they knew about Targaryens. He thought about whether his father had been right, not about the particulars, the elopement, the war, the decisions that got people killed. About the deeper thing underneath it, the prophecy. The belief that the long night was coming back, that a hero was needed, that drastic action was justified in the name of a greater necessity. Jon had read about the long night. He had read the histories and the legends and the old accounts, the ones the Meisters put in the back sections of their scrolls with footnotes explaining why these stories shouldn't be taken literally. He had read them all. He was not certain the Meisters were right. He didn't know if his father had been right either. He was 13, not omniscient. But he thought, if the long night is real and something in him, some cold instinct that lived below thought believed it was, then the question of who sits on the Iron Throne becomes almost embarrassingly small by comparison. He rolled the scroll back up and returned it to the drawer. He walked back across the yard in the dark, Ghost a pale shadow at his side, and the stars above Winterfell were cold and hard and vast. He looked up at them. He thought about a father he had never met, who had believed in something so strongly that he had broken the world over it. He thought, I will not be that kind of certain. He thought, I will look at the evidence, I will find people who were there. I will learn the shape of things before I decide what the shape means, he thought. And then when I know, I will act, not before. He was the son of a man who had been famous for dreaming and a woman who had been famous for her fire. From his father, he had perhaps inherited the dreaming. From his mother, and he thought of her always as someone he knew through inference rather than memory, a shape defined by the hole she'd left. He hoped he had inherited something more practical, the sense to wait until you could see what you were swinging at. The morning of departure, the king left on a gray Wednesday morning, which was at least seasonally appropriate. The procession reassembled itself with the groaning inevitability of something that had only reluctantly stopped and was now resentfully starting again. The wheelhouse lurched. The knights found their horses. The ladies from the south looked at the sky with expressions of profound personal betrayal. Jon stood in his assigned spot, 3 places down from Robb, 1 place left of Theon, absolutely not in any position of prominence, and watched the king say his farewells. He watched Ned and Robert embrace again. He watched Ned's face again, that complicated mixture. He thought, Ned has been carrying this weight for 13 years. He has kept a secret that could get him killed and gotten nothing for it except the satisfaction of doing right by a dead sister's child. And he has never once made Jon feel like a burden for it, not directly, not in words. Jon thought, I would very much like to not get Ned Stark killed. He added it to the list of reasons to be careful. The list was getting long, the royal party moved. And then, near the gate, Robert Baratheon turned on his horse and looked back. His gaze swept the assembled household of Winterfell with the lazy thoroughness of a man who looked at things the way other men breathed, habitually, without much thought. It passed over the servants and the guards and Robb and Theon and Sansa and Arya and all the rest. It stopped on Jon, just for a moment, just long enough for Jon to feel it. The king's brow creased slightly, the way it might if you were trying to remember a word that was just at the edge of recall. Then someone said something behind him and he turned away, and the gates of Winterfell swallowed the sound of hooves and wheels and fading royal pageantry. Jon stood very still. Robb appeared at his shoulder. He looked at you again. Yes. What do you think that means? Jon considered several answers. It means, he said finally, that I need to be something other than a boy in a courtyard when the king looks next time. Robb looked at him sideways. Jon, not yet. Jon watched the last of the procession disappear through the gate. But eventually. I need to be someone that a king can't just make disappear because it would be convenient. Robb was quiet for a moment, then in the tone he used when he'd decided something and was issuing it as settled fact. Then we'd better make sure you're ready. Jon looked at him. I said we. Robb's voice had a familiar stubbornness to it, the immovable quality of the North itself. You're my brother, whatever you are, whatever this is we. Is that clear? Jon thought about the corridor outside Ned's solar, about the silence where the answer should have been. About a king on a horse who had looked at him twice. He thought about a father who had made every decision alone on the basis of certainty he hadn't earned, and a war that had swallowed everything. We, he agreed. Ghost had been sitting between them. At this, the wolf stood and shook himself, apparently considering the matter settled, and walked toward the warmth of the great hall. Jon and Robb followed. Behind them, the gates of Winterfell were closing, and somewhere to the south, a king was riding toward his capital with a vague feeling he couldn't name, a something about the eyes that he would not think about again for years. Until he did. Chapter 3. 2 Crowns, 1 Blood Winterfell, 298 AC. Jon is 17. Ned had been in King's Landing for 4 months, which was 3 months and 3 weeks longer than Jon had expected him to last. This was not a criticism. It was an observation based on everything Jon knew about Eddard Stark, which was considerable, and everything he knew about King's Landing, which was theoretical but thorough. Ned was constitutionally unsuited to the capital. He was a man built for direct lines and cold air and problems you could solve with a sword or, failing that, with honesty. King's Landing was a city of indirect lines and warm rot and problems that got worse every time you tried to solve them honestly. The ravens came regularly, which was reassuring. They said little, which was less so. John read between the lines the way Ned had taught him to read everything, carefully and with the understanding that what was not written was often more important than what was. The ravens said the political situation was complicated. The ravens said the king's health was poor. The ravens said that John should continue his training and study, and that Robb was doing well in his responsibilities. The ravens did not say, "I am afraid." Ned Stark did not say he was afraid in writing, but the shape of the sentences had changed over the weeks, shorter, more careful, the words chosen with the specific precision of a man who knew his correspondence might be read by others. John noticed this. He did not say anything about it to Robb because Robb was already carrying the weight of a castle, and because sometimes knowing a thing and saying it out loud were two different problems. He trained harder. He did not know what he was preparing for. He prepared anyway. Ghost had reached a size that caused newcomers to Winterfell to stop dead in the yard and reconsider their life choices. He was past the point where anyone called him a direwolf with confidence. He was something else, something that belonged to the older stories, the ones old Nan told in a lower voice. He moved through the castle like smoke and ate what he wished and answered to Jon only, which was how Jon preferred it. The cold did not bother Jon anymore. He had noticed this gradually, the way you notice a drip only after it has been dripping for some time. The other men pulled their cloaks tighter in the training yard on winter mornings. Jon did not. He stood in the snow in light wool and felt the cold as a fact rather than an imposition, which was, he had gathered from Luwin's reaction when he mentioned it, not normal. He had stopped mentioning it. 1 month later, the raven came before dawn. Jon was already awake. He often was before dawn, which was another thing he had stopped mentioning, and he heard the wing beat and the flutter and the particular urgency of a bird that had flown through the night. He was dressed and at the Meister's tower before Luwin had finished reading it. He could tell from Luwin's face. Before the Meister said a word, before Jon had seen a single letter of the message, he could tell. He had learned long ago to read the faces of careful people, and Luwin was a careful person with an old face that had kept many secrets but could not keep this one. "Ned," Jon said. Luwin looked at him. "He has been taken. Lord Stark has been arrested on a charge of treason." Jon was quiet for a moment. "The king is dead. King Robert died of a hunting wound 5 days ago. The new king is Joffrey." Jon sat down, not because his legs gave out, they didn't, but because he wanted to think and he thought better sitting. He considered the information with the cold, systematic part of his mind that he kept for exactly this purpose, the part that could take in terrible things and sort them before the rest of him caught up. Joffrey was King Joffrey, who held his sword wrong and whose ears went red when he lost. Who had looked at Jon in the yard with that dark, cornered animal expression, who would now have the full apparatus of the throne at his disposal, and Ned was his prisoner. "There is a second message," Luwin said. He held out a smaller piece of parchment, not a raven's scroll, but something torn hurriedly from the edge of something else. The handwriting was Ned's, but rushed, the letters stripped to their essentials. It was folded inside the main scroll. "It is addressed to you." Jon took it. It said, "Lyanna Stark, Tower of Joy." "Howland Reed knows," it said. "I am sorry it took me this long," it said. "Be careful, be brave, be better than all of us." It did not say goodbye. Because Ned Stark would not write goodbye unless he was certain he needed to, and Jon understood this, and the understanding was its own kind of grief. He folded the paper and put it inside his shirt against his chest. He stood up. "How long does he have?" Jon asked. Luwin shook his head slowly. "That depends on what Joffrey decides to. How long does he realistically have?" The Meister looked at his hands. "Not long, if Joffrey is king in fact and not just in name, and if Cersei is guiding him, and if they want to make an example." He stopped. "Not long," Jon nodded. "Wake Robb," he said. "He needs to know immediately." He walked out of the tower and stood in the dark yard of Winterfell, and Ghost came from nowhere and pressed his great white side against Jon's leg, and Jon put his hand on the wolf's head and stood very still. The stars were the same. The cold was the same. The walls of Winterfell were the same gray stone they had always been. Everything had changed. He allowed himself 30 seconds of something that was not quite grief yet, because grief required leisure and he did not have leisure. He allowed himself to feel fully in the wordless place below thought that the only man who had known his whole truth was sitting in a dungeon in the south, and that the world was a worse and more dangerous place for it. Then he began to think about what happened next. Rob's reaction was simpler and more violent, which John had expected, and he did not try to calm it because Rob needed to move through it. And you could not hurry Rob Stark through his feelings any more than you could hurry a river. He let Rob pace and swear and put his fist through a door that had not deserved it. He let Theon say unhelpful things, and Maester Lewin say careful things, and Lady Catelyn arrive, and say the things that a mother says when her husband is a prisoner of a boy king, which were also fairly violent but considerably more strategically focused. He stood in the corner of the solar and let it all move through the room like a storm, and when it had passed its worst, he spoke. "You're going south," John said. Rob looked at him. His eyes were red-edged, but his jaw was set. "Yes, the northern lords will rally to you. They will." Rob said it with the absolute certainty of someone who has tested his ground and knows it is solid. John had always admired this about him. Rob's confidence was not arrogance, it was inventory. He knew what he had. "Then you should go," John said. "You should ride and rally and bring them home." Rob studied him. Something careful moved behind his eyes. "Come with me." It was what John had been expecting him to say, and he had his answer ready, and it was still the hardest word he had said in years. "No." The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Catelyn looked at him sharply. Theon looked surprised, which was unusual. Lewin looked at the floor. "John," Rob started, "I can't ride south with you, not as what I am." John kept his voice level. "A nameless ward with no claim, no house, no standing, I would be a liability. And if Joffrey's people started asking questions about who I was and where I came from, the answers would put you in danger. I will not do that." "Then ride as my brother." Rob's voice was fierce, the North in it. "Nobody has to know. Everybody eventually knows everything, Rob." "You know that." John looked at him steadily. "I have something I need to do first, something I should have done already." He thought of the piece of paper against his chest. "When I come back, I will not be nobody, I promise you that." Rob stared at him for a long time. The stubbornness was there, and the anger, and underneath both of those something more complicated, the look of a man who wants to argue and knows, in the part of himself that his pride hasn't reached, that the argument would be wrong. "Where are you going?" Rob said finally. "South." John smiled slightly. "Same direction as you, different road." Rob crossed the room in 3 steps and embraced him with the full force of someone who had decided that words were insufficient. John embraced him back. "Don't get killed," Rob said into his shoulder. "You don't get killed," John said. "I'm serious." "So am I." They separated. Rob's eyes were wet, and he was not going to acknowledge it, and John was not going to make him. He looked at Catelyn instead, who was watching him with the expression he knew well. The complicated one, not hostile, not warm, the one that lived in the particular territory between those two countries. "My lady," he said. "John," she said. And then, after a pause that contained several things she was deciding not to say, "Be safe." It was more than he had expected. He nodded once, he left before he could change his mind. The neck, 1 week later, the neck was not hospitable. This was its primary selling point. It was a vast stretch of bog and marsh and tangled forest that sat between the north and the rest of Westeros, like a bouncer who had been at the door so long he had merged with the doorframe. It was wet in ways that other places were not just the rain, which was persistent and personal, but the ground itself, which could not decide whether it was land or water and had settled on both simultaneously. Trees grew sideways out of black water. Paths disappeared. Midges colonized the air with the enthusiasm of an occupying force. John had been in the neck for 4 days and had lost a boot to a bog on the second. He had replaced it with a cloth wrapping that was now also wet, because everything in the neck was wet, which was the neck's one consistent policy. Ghost moved through it all with contemptuous ease, large paws finding solid ground by some instinct that John lacked and envied. He occasionally looked back at John with an expression that said, as clearly as expressions could, "This is your fault for having only 2 legs." "I know," John told him. He had a direction but not quite a destination, which was the problem with Greywater Watch. It moved. Howland Reed's seat moved through the marshes, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily enough that no army had ever managed to find it when it didn't want to be found. John was betting that one man with a direwolf, traveling alone and slowly and with no hostile intent, might be received differently. He was also betting that Howland Reed had been waiting for him. He wasn't sure why he believed this. It was something between instinct and inference, The sense that a man who had kept a secret for 17 years and who had watched that secret become an increasingly unstable arrangement would be thinking about what happened next. Would be ready, maybe, for the moment when the boy arrived. He was right. The boat appeared on the third evening, long, shallow, Cranagman-built, poled by a girl of about 14 with brown hair and serious eyes, and an expression that suggested she'd been expecting him about a day and a half ago and found his lateness mildly disappointing. Jon Snow. She said, not a question. Yes, I'm Mira Reed. My father sent me. She looked at Ghost. Is the wolf safe to bring on the boat? Yes, the boat might sink. Ghost weighs less than he looks. She considered this skeptically, then shrugged with the practicality of someone who has been raised in a marsh and has therefore seen stranger things. Get in, then. Ghost got in the boat with the dignity of a creature doing you an enormous favor. The boat sat low in the water but held. Mira pulled them through the reeds in silence, which Jon appreciated. How long have you known I was coming? He asked after a while. 3 days, she said. Father said to wait by the South Reed Road, said you'd be later than you thought because the west path looks solid but isn't. The boot was not my fault then. Mira almost smiled. It never is. Howland Reed was a small man. This was the first thing Jon registered, and he filed it immediately because the mind, when it has been building a picture of someone for years, sometimes forgets to account for the basic fact of a person's dimensions. He had been imagining Howland Reed as not large exactly, but significant. Substantial. Size to match the weight of what he knew. Howland Reed was 5.5 feet tall, slight, with green-gray eyes that had a stillness in them that reminded Jon unexpectedly of the pool in the Winterfell Godswood. He was sitting outside on a log when the boat arrived, as though he had been waiting not in urgency but in patience, the way you wait for something you know is coming and have made your peace with. He looked at Jon for a long moment without speaking. Jon looked back. You have her eyes. Howland Reed said finally. Lyanna's eyes. I thought you would have Rhaegar's coloring and you do, but the eyes are hers. Something shifted in Jon's chest. He had been expecting confirmation. He had not been expecting to feel it. Tell me, Jon said, all of it, please. Howland looked at him for another moment, then nodded slowly and began. He told it the way a Cranagman told things, without ornament, without drama, just the facts laid in sequence, each one placed carefully where it belonged. He told Jon about the Tower of Joy. About the 3 Kingsguard who were waiting there, the greatest knights alive, guarding a tower in the middle of Dorne for a prince who was already dead. About Ned and the 6 men who rode with him, and how only 2 of them had walked away. He told Jon about Lyanna. She was in a bed, Howland said. In the tower, it had been a difficult birth. She had been there for weeks. He was quiet for a moment. She was glad to see her father's face, even with what was happening. She was glad. What were her last words? Jon asked. His voice was steady. He had decided it would be. Howland looked at him with those still gray-green eyes. She made Ned promise to keep you safe. She called you by a name. A pause. Aegon, she had chosen a name. Aegon Targaryen, for your father's house, for all the kings that had been. She said it was the name of a conqueror. Jon absorbed this. Then she said, I remember this precisely because I have carried it for 17 years, and some things become very clear when you know you will carry them that long. Howland Reed straightened slightly. She said, promise me, Ned, promise me he will know not what to do with it, just what he is. Promise he will know. Jon was quiet for a long time. Around them the marsh moved gently, reed beds whispering, water reflecting the late sun in pieces. She wanted me to know, he said. Yes, Ned almost didn't tell me until I was 5. Something that wasn't quite a laugh escaped him. She'd have been furious. She had a temper, Howland agreed, and something warm moved across his face. She was extraordinary. Everyone talks about her beauty. They should talk about her mind. She saw things clearly and early. He paused. She knew, I think, that Rhaegar's certainty was going to cost them everything. She was afraid of it, but she loved him too. Both things were true. Both things are often true, Jon said. Howland looked at him with an expression Jon could not quite read. You are more like her than I expected. He said, Rhaegar would have asked about the prophecy first. Jon considered this. What was the prophecy, the prince that was promised? A hero to be born of the line of Aerys and Rhaella who would stand against the darkness when it came again. The long night reborn. Howland's voice was careful. Rhaegar believed it referred to a child he would father. He spent his life researching it. He reorganized his entire existence around it. Did it refer to me? I don't know. I'm not sure Rhaegar knew. I'm not sure certainty was ever available on that question. John nodded. Then I won't be certain. Howland studied him. That's a very specific thing to say. My father died for a certainty he might not have had the right to. John kept his voice even. I intend to be more careful than that. The Cranogman was quiet for a moment, then. He would have found you maddening, you know, your father. You're everything he valued most, courage, intelligence, conviction, but you've arranged it into a shape he wouldn't have recognized. He was a dreamer. You're a thinker. Someone needed to be, John said. That night, by the river, he sat alone where the marsh water met a small, clear tributary, shallow and quick over smooth stones, and the stars came out one by one over the neck. He had asked for solitude, and Mira had given it to him without fuss, which he was grateful for. Ghost was upstream doing something to a fish. John could hear the splashing and chose not to investigate. He was Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name. He turned it over, examined it. Tried it on the way you try on a coat that has been made for you by someone who knew your measurements, but that you've never actually worn. It fit, of course it fit, it was his, but it felt strange. The name was enormous. It had weight that his own name did not, the weight of 300 years of dragons and conquest and fire and madness and glory and ruin, all of it pressing down on a collection of 3 syllables. He was also Jon Snow. He was the boy who had sat on floors with Ned and eaten snow off window ledges with Robb, and learned to fight in Winterfell's yard, and named a white wolf for silence, and read in Lewin's library by stolen candlelight and lain awake at night listening to the wind come off the moors. He was the boy who had said okay when Ned told him his father was dead and gone back to playing, because sometimes that was all you could do with enormous things, acknowledge them and keep moving. Both of these things were true. He had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to tell him he had to choose. Some internal committee meeting where the question was put, Targaryen or Stark, dragon or wolf, fire or ice, which one are you and which one do you set aside? Nobody was going to call that meeting. The question itself was wrong. He had his father's blood, and his mother's eyes and Ned's values and Robb's definition of brother and Ghost's definition of loyalty and 17 years of a secret that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. You could not reach into a person and remove the inconvenient parts. You could not be selectively whole. He was going to be both. He was Aegon Targaryen, and the name meant something. It meant that he had a claim and a history and obligations he had not asked for, and that there were people in the world who would try to use that name for their own purposes, and people who would try to destroy it for their own safety. And he would have to navigate both with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything else. He was Jon Snow, and the name meant something too. It meant that he had been raised by the most honorable man he had ever known, and that he believed in the things that man believed in. And that those beliefs were not weaknesses to be shed when power became available, but were in fact the entire point. The two names sat inside him like twin flames, not competing, not canceling each other out, just burning. The way things that belong together burn when they've been apart and are finally in the same room again. He thought about the long night. He did not know if he was the prince that was promised. He had no way of knowing that, and he distrusted the kind of thinking that started from the assumption and worked backward to the evidence. But he knew, in the place below thought, in the cold instinct that had been telling him things since he was 11, that the threat in the north was real. He had read enough. He had paid enough attention to the old accounts, the ones the Meisters dismissed. Something was coming, something old and enormous and cold. And here was the thing that his father had missed, or perhaps had glimpsed and then lost in the brightness of his own certainty. It did not matter whose name was on the throne if the long night came back. It did not matter whether the Targaryens had reclaimed their birthright, or the Baratheons kept their stolen one, or whether Robb Stark rode south and made himself king of something. None of it mattered if there was no kingdom left to argue about. This was, John thought, the piece that kept getting dropped. Everyone was playing the Game of Thrones. Nobody was paying sufficient attention to the fact that the board itself was about to be destroyed. He needed allies. He needed to not be a secret. He needed to be in a position where he could say, "There is a threat, and I know it, and here is what we must do," and have people listen, not because he was charming or powerful in the narrow political sense, but because he had the standing to be heard. He needed, eventually, to be Aegon Targaryen openly, but not yet, not until he understood the shape of things well enough to know where to stand. Ghost came back from the river, wet to the shoulder, apparently successful. He shook himself extensively and then lay down against John's side with the complacency of a creature who has had a good evening and sees no reason to be modest about it. "I have a plan," John told him. Ghost did not look impressed. He had heard John say this before. "I know it's not a very detailed plan yet," John conceded. "It's more the beginning of an intention with ambitions toward becoming a plan." Ghost closed his eyes. "The broad outlines are, find Daenerys Targaryen. She has dragons. Someone needs dragons. If the long night comes, dragons are not optional." He paused. "Also, I should probably tell her about me before she does something politically inconvenient." Ghost snorted. "Fair point. She might do something politically inconvenient regardless." He looked up at the stars. Across the neck, distantly, he could see a smear of light that might have been a fire, Robb's camp perhaps, the bannermen gathering. His brother riding south to fight a war over a throne. But that's Robb's problem for now, and Robb is, annoyingly, very good at his problems. He sat for another while. The night settled around him. Somewhere in the reeds, something moved, a bird or a frog or one of the small, mysterious creatures of the neck that had no interest in the wars of men. He thought, for the last time that night, about his father. About a man who had played a harp so beautifully that people wept, who had believed in a prophecy and bet everything on it, who had made a decision in a tournament yard that he might have thought was love or destiny or the beginning of a solution, and that had turned out to be the beginning of a war. He thought, "I will not bet everything on my certainty, but I will act. I will not be paralyzed by caution. I will just make sure the action is the right one before I take it." He thought, "I am ready." He was 17 years old and he had never met a dragon, and he had no army and no ship and no treasury, and his most valuable asset was a large white wolf with an attitude problem. The odds were not in his favor by any conventional measure. But Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, had been assessed as insufficient by the world since he was 5 years old, and he had learned to find that assessment motivating rather than discouraging. He stood. He brushed the marsh grass off his breeches. "Right," he said to Ghost. "Let's go find a Targaryen." Ghost opened one eye. "I know we're also one. That's not the point." Ghost stood. He was, in the starlight and the marsh dark, something out of the oldest stories. The ones before the first men, before the children, before the recorded world. He was a ghost and a wolf, and something more than either. And he walked beside Jon through the reeds with the authority of a creature that knows exactly where it is going even when its boy does not. They headed south. Behind them, the neck closed over their path like water, and the stars burned on, and somewhere to the north, beyond the wall, in the country where the dead walked and the cold had a will of its own, something ancient turned its attention very slowly in the direction of a boy and his wolf. It did not hurry. It had all the time in the world. It did not know yet that Jon Snow had decided to be ready. Chapter 4, Fire and Ice. The Narrow Sea. Jon is 18. The Narrow Sea was narrow only in the sense that the word narrow had, at some point in history, suffered a catastrophic loss of meaning. It was not narrow. It was enormous. It was gray and violent and deeply committed to the idea that Jon Snow had no business crossing it. A view it expressed through waves that came from directions water was not supposed to come from, a wind that seemed personally offended, and a smell that defied description but which Jon eventually settled on as, what if fish had opinions? He had booked passage on a merchant vessel out of White Harbor by the simple method of offering the captain everything he had, which was enough silver to make the man's eyes go wide and his ethics go elsewhere. The captain's name was Galler, and he had a red beard and the cheerful fatalism of a man who had nearly drowned often enough to find the prospect boring. "Your wolf," Galler said on the first morning, looking at Ghost, "is making my crew nervous." "He does that," Jon said. "He's sitting at the prow. He likes the front. He's been sitting there since we left harbor. He hasn't moved. He's been staring at the horizon." Jon looked at Ghost, who was indeed sitting at the prow in the fog, white and enormous and entirely still, looking at nothing in particular with the focused intensity of a creature who might be navigating or might be contemplating the fundamental nature of water. It was impossible to tell with Ghost. "He's fine," Jon said. "He's giving Harrel nightmares." "Who's Harrel?" "My best sailor." Galler paused. "Was my best sailor. He's considering a career change." Jon spent most of the crossing being sick over the rail, which was undignified and deeply inconsistent with his sense of himself as someone who was prepared for most situations. Ghost watched him from the prow without sympathy. This was perhaps the most honest thing Ghost had ever communicated. The wolf did not get sick. The wolf found the sea entirely acceptable. The wolf was, in John's view, being very smug about it. Not a word, John told him between episodes. Ghost looked at the horizon. I know you can't speak. That's not the point. They made Pentos in 9 days. John stood on the dock, solid ground under his feet for the first time in nearly a fortnight, and decided that whatever happened in Essos, he was going home by a different route. Possibly overland, possibly through places that did not exist. He would work it out. Ghost stepped off the ship and immediately began investigating the dock with the thoroughness of a customs official, which caused the Pentoshi stevedores to back away in a respectful semicircle. This was useful. The crowd parted ahead of them all the way to the city gate, which saved considerable time. Meereen. 6 weeks later, Daenerys Targaryen had conquered Meereen 3 months before Jon arrived, which he knew because the slave collars on the pyramids had been torn down and replaced with the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen, and because everyone he spoke to told him about it unprompted. With the specific enthusiasm of people who are still adjusting to an enormous change and need to talk about it regularly to make it feel real. He had crossed Essos in stages, picking up information the way a ship picks up barnacles, slowly, without noticing until suddenly there was quite a lot of it. He knew by the time he reached Meereen that Daenerys had 3 dragons and an army of Unsullied and a title that went on for some time. He knew she had freed slaves across 3 cities. He knew that the slaver lords hated her with the frantic intensity of people whose entire worldview depended on something she had just made illegal. He knew that she was trying to rule a city that did not particularly want to be ruled by her, which was a problem he had some theoretical understanding of. What he had not known and could not have prepared for from descriptions alone was what it felt like to be in the same city as 3 living dragons. It was not a sound exactly. It was a pressure. A low thrum beneath the air, like a second heartbeat that belonged to the city rather than to him, a vibration he felt in his chest and his bones and the back of his teeth. He had dreamed about fire for years. He had not known the reality of it came with this particular physical quality, this sense of something ancient and vast breathing nearby, breathing in a rhythm that you found yourself unconsciously matching. Ghost walked closer to his side than usual. Even Ghost apparently had opinions about dragons. I know, Jon said. Ghost made a sound that was not quite a growl, an acknowledgement. They went on. Getting an audience with the mother of dragons proved more difficult than getting across the narrow sea and considerably less nauseating. Her people were everywhere, unsullied guards with their spears and their impassive faces, Dothraki outriders who looked at Ghost with the first genuine interest anyone had shown anything in days. Freed slaves who served the queen with the fervor of people who had been given something they had not expected and intended to keep it. He was stopped 4 times. The 5th person who stopped him was a woman of extraordinary composure in a plain dress who looked at him the way a very good library catalogues an unfamiliar text. Quickly, thoroughly, and without obvious reaction. She introduced herself as Missandei, the queen's translator and counselor, and she asked him in 3 languages, the common tongue, High Valyrian, and something else Jon didn't recognize, why he wished to see the queen. Jon thought about how to answer this for a moment. Tell her, he said, that Rhaegar Targaryen's son has come from Westeros to speak with his father's daughter. Missandei's composure did not break. It bent slightly at one corner, like a very controlled person involuntarily experiencing surprise. I will deliver your message, she said. Thank you. The wolf will need to remain outside. Ghost looked at the pyramid of Meereen. He looked at Jon. His expression said with considerable economy, I will remain outside, but let the record show I find this arrangement insulting. He'll stay, Jon said. He's not happy about it. Very few people who wait outside are, Missandei said, and led him in. The throne room of Meereen's Great Pyramid was absurdly tall, which Jon suspected was the point. Ceilings that high did not exist for practical reasons. They existed to make people feel small, to make the distance between the floor where you stood and the seat where power rested feel like a journey rather than a walk. It was architecture as argument. Whoever sits at the top of this room is very far above you. Consider your position accordingly. He considered it. He found it interesting rather than intimidating, which he suspected was not the intended reaction. Daenerys Targaryen sat in a carved chair at the far end, not quite a throne but arranged like one, the posture deliberate. She was smaller than he'd imagined, and more compelling than any description had prepared him for. She had the silver-gold hair of the old Targaryen bloodline and eyes that were a particular shade of violet that Jon had only ever seen in illuminated manuscripts. And she sat with the stillness of someone who had learned very young that stillness was itself a form of power. She was 19 or close to it. She looked older. Life in exile had that effect. Beside her stood a white-haired man in the armor of a knight who was watching Jon with an expression Jon could not read. He was old, past 60, with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime being the most capable person in the room and had made peace with the responsibility that came with that. Jon recognized him. He had read enough history. Sir Barristan Selmy, formerly Lord Commander of the Kingsguard under Robert Baratheon, who had served the Targaryen kings before him. A man who had known Rhaegar. Their eyes met briefly. Barristan looked at him for just a moment too long. Jon filed this away and approached the chair. He stopped at a reasonable distance and inclined his head, not the full bow, which would have been a lie, but a respectful acknowledgement that stopped well short of submission. If she noticed the calibration, she gave no sign. "You claim to be Rhaegar Targaryen's son," Daenerys said. Her voice was measured, regal. She was testing the word claim to see how he responded to it. "I don't claim it," Jon said. "I am," something that might have been amusement crossed her face. "Everyone who wants something from me discovers a Targaryen connection." "I imagine so." "I want nothing from you. I came to tell you something." "How magnanimous." The amusement sharpened slightly. "And what is it you've come to tell me?" "That the long night is coming. That what's beyond the wall in Westeros is real, and it's moving, and it will kill everything if nobody does anything about it. And that 2 living Targaryens with 3 dragons are considerably better positioned to do something about it than 1 Targaryen with 3 dragons who doesn't know the other one exists." Silence in the throne room. The advisors exchanged glances. Daenerys studied him with those extraordinary eyes. "You're very direct," she said. "It's a family failing," Jon said, "or so I'm told." This time the amusement was real. She suppressed it quickly, but he saw it. "Your mother, Lyanna Stark of Winterfell, Ned Stark's sister. She died in the Tower of Joy in Dorne shortly after I was born. My father, your brother, died at the Trident before she did. I was raised in secret by Ned Stark because if Robert Baratheon had known I existed, he would have had me killed." He watched her process this. She was quick. He had expected that, and the quickness was not the flighty kind but the deep, integrating kind that took in new information and restructured what it knew around it without drama. "You have no proof," she said. "I have a witness. Howland Reed, who is at the Tower of Joy and will speak if asked." He paused. "I also have other evidence, less conventional." "What evidence?" Jon looked at the door. "May I bring my wolf in?" A pause. "Your wolf is not proof of parentage." "No. But what I want to show you requires more space than this room comfortably provides, and I'd rather Ghost was present for it." She considered him for a moment. Then she looked at Missandei, who opened a side door, and a guard went to fetch Ghost, who arrived looking like he had been sitting outside composing a formal complaint and intended to deliver it at some point. "Now," Daenerys said, still in the measuring tone, "what is this unconventional evidence?" "Send for Drogon," Jon said. The room went very still. The kind of still that happens when someone says something that falls entirely outside the established categories of things people say. Daenerys looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because Targaryens don't burn," he kept his voice level. "And because a dragon will know." Drogon came through the high window like weather, not arriving so much as happening, all at once, filling the top third of the throne room with the sound of enormous wings and the heat of a body the size of a small ship. He landed on the carved stone ledge above the throne room floor and folded himself with the slow authority of something that has never once been afraid of anything and intends to keep it that way. He was black. Not dark gray, not very dark brown, black in the way that a hole in the world is black, an absence where color had given up. His eyes were orange gold, and they moved across the room with the unhurried intelligence of a predator that knows it is the apex of every food chain in every room it has ever entered. They found Jon. Ghost made a sound Jon had never heard from him before, not fear exactly, but a profound recalibration of the world, the sound of a creature encountering something that rewrites the categories. He pressed against Jon's side and stayed there. Jon did not move. He had spent 8 years dreaming about fire. Standing in a throne room in a city he'd never seen 6 months ago, with the largest living creature in the world looking at him from 20 feet away, he understood for the first time what those dreams had actually been. Not warnings, not prophecy. Memory, something in his blood remembering what it came from. Drogon lifted off the ledge. Someone in the room made a sound of alarm. Jon heard it distantly, the way you hear things through water. His entire attention was on the dragon. He could feel the heat of him from here, not uncomfortable, not threatening, just present. The way sunlight is present. A fact of the world, not a danger. He stood still. Drogon descended in a slow spiral, massive wings catching air, until he hovered at eye level 10 feet away. Jon could see the texture of his scales, could feel the downdraft of each wingbeat moving his hair, could see in those ancient orange eyes something he could not name, recognition maybe, or its cousin. The dragon exhaled, not fire. Just breathe, hot, sulphurous, vast, washing over Jon like the opening of a furnace door. Jon breathed it in. He did not flinch. His skin felt warm the way it felt warm in front of a hearth, not the way it felt when you'd put your hand somewhere you shouldn't. He was fine. He was, apparently, completely fine. Drogon dropped lower and put his head, enormous, scarred, smelling of smoke and old sky, about a foot from Jon's face. Jon looked into one orange eye. "Hello," he said. Ghost pressed harder against his side. Jon put his hand on the wolf's head without looking away from the dragon. An absurd thought crossed his mind. This is the most fire and ice anything has ever been. Drogon exhaled again, warmer this time. Then he lifted, circled once, and returned to his ledge. He curled there and regarded the room with magnificent disinterest. The throne room was absolutely silent. Jon turned around. Daenerys was on her feet. She had not intended to stand. He could see it in her posture, the micro-expression of someone who has done something involuntarily and is deciding how to reframe it. Her face had done something complicated and was now reassembling itself into composure. Beside her, Sir Barristan Selmy had gone the color of old parchment. He was staring at Jon with the expression of a man who has just seen a ghost, which was, Jon reflected, not an entirely inaccurate description of the situation. "Your Grace," Barristan said. His voice was rough. There is something about him, his face. He is the shape of the jaw and he stopped, started again. "I knew Rhaegar Targaryen, Your Grace, for 20 years, and I cannot say with certainty but, Daenerys repeated softly, "but I am not certain he is not who he says he is." Jon thought, coming from Barristan Selmy, that sentence is worth more than a sworn testimony from anyone else in the known world. He waited. "Leave us," Daenerys said. The room cleared with remarkable efficiency. When the last advisor had gone and the door had closed and it was just the two of them and Ghost and Drogon 40 feet overhead, she sat back down. She looked at Jon for a long moment, then she said, "My brother." "My aunt," Jon said. They looked at each other. A beat of silence that contained a very large number of complicated thoughts, which both of them allowed to remain unspoken by unspoken agreement. "This is strange," Daenerys said. "Yes," Jon agreed. "I had a brother, Viserys. He was not," she stopped. "He was not well toward the end. I'm sorry." "Are you?" Jon considered this honestly. "I'm sorry you had to watch that happen to someone you once loved." Yes, something shifted in her expression, softened slightly without quite becoming warm. She was deciding something about him. He waited. "Tell me about the long night," she said. 2 weeks later, the dragon Pens Regal was green and bronze and deeply suspicious of Jon specifically, which was the most honest response anyone had had to him in some time. The 3 dragons were kept, loosely, theoretically, in the lower levels of the pyramid. Drogon came and went as he liked, which was always. Viserion and Regal were more territorial, more prone to staying in a general area, which made them marginally less alarming to the city's population while still being, objectively, enormous fire-breathing creatures living in a basement. Regal was named for Rhaegar. Jon had known this intellectually, standing in front of the dragon and knowing it was a different experience entirely. He was bronze and green where Drogon was black, and where Drogon's eyes held that ancient, unsettling intelligence, Regal's were more direct, fiercer, more reactive, less settled in his own myth. He also, Jon had noticed during 3 careful observation sessions over 2 weeks, liked to be left alone unless he wanted company, at which point he wanted company immediately and without question. "You've been watching him for 2 weeks, Daenerys said from the doorway. She had taken to appearing when he was here, which John suspected was partly genuine curiosity and partly the reasonable inclination to keep an eye on the man who had shown up claiming to share her bloodline. "I wanted to understand him before I tried," John said. "Most men who attempt to ride dragons don't wait 2 weeks. Most men who attempt to ride dragons are not riding a dragon named after their dead father." He paused. It seemed worth being thoughtful. She came to stand beside him. They looked at Rhaegar, who looked back at them with the expression of a creature that has opinions about being looked at. "He may not accept you," Daenerys said. "Even Drogon's reaction doesn't guarantee, I know. If he doesn't accept you, he'll attempt to kill you. He nearly killed 3 of my Dothraki who got too close." "I know that too. You're very calm." "I'm terrified," John said. "I find calm more useful." She looked at him sideways. He'd noticed she did that, a quick sideways look like she was checking a calculation. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Know what you're feeling and do a different thing anyway." John thought about it. "I don't know. I've always been able to. My Ned could do it too. His face never moved when he was afraid." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it's a Stark thing or a Targaryen thing," she said. "My other brother, Viserys, couldn't do it at all. Every feeling he had was immediately visible. He couldn't separate feeling from action." She paused. "It made him predictable. Predictable is dangerous when you're powerless." "Yes." Rhaegar had gotten bored of being stared at and turned away. His tail moved once, a slow arc, knocking a carved stone column sideways. "Tomorrow," John said. Daenerys nodded. It went badly, and then it went worse, and then something shifted and it became the most extraordinary thing John had ever experienced. And then it nearly killed him, and then it was fine. This was, Daenerys told him afterward, a perfectly normal first ride. Rhaegar accepted him, that part worked, though accepted was perhaps too gentle a word for the process. The dragon turned when John put his hand on his neck, and the look he gave was the look of a creature making a decision he hasn't entirely made peace with, and then he bent his head and John climbed. Ghost sat in the corner and watched with the expression of a wolf who had extensive concerns but recognized there was nothing to be done. The first 30 seconds were pure terror. Not because Rhaegar threw him or tried to burn him, or did any of the obvious things a dragon might do to communicate displeasure. He simply flew. Straight up, through the opening in the pyramid roof, into Mirian's afternoon sky with a force that compressed John against his neck like a hand pressing down, and then banked hard left, then harder right. Then dropped 50 feet in a single second for no reason John could identify and then climbed again. The wind tore at John's eyes. The city of Mirian became a map below him, the pyramids and the harbor and the Skahazadhan River winding brown through it, and the Giskari Bay beyond, and the sea past that, endless and small from up here. The height was not frightening. The height was shockingly not frightening at all. What was frightening was the speed and the complete absence of any control whatsoever. John gripped the neck and thought, "Okay, I need to establish a relationship here, not impose a direction. Rhaegar is not a horse. Rhaegar is not a ship. He is a creature with his own intelligence and his own intentions, and what I need to do is communicate, not command." He loosened his grip, slightly, enough to signal something. Rhaegar felt it. The dragon's head turned slightly, just the angle a few degrees, enough to tell John he'd been noticed. John thought forward. He thought it without words, just the feeling of it, the direction of it. He leaned fractionally. Rhaegar leveled out. He was still going fast, terrifyingly fast, but in a straight line now toward the bay, the wind screaming past John's ears. "All right," John said to the wind and the dragon and no one in particular. "We can work with this." They were in the air for 2 hours. John could not have told you all of what happened in those 2 hours. It existed in his memory as a series of impressions rather than a sequence, the way extreme things sometimes do. He learned the shape of Rhaegar's responses the way you learn the grammar of a new language. Imperfectly, by accumulating examples, understanding patterns before you understand rules. When they came back down, Daenerys was standing in the courtyard with her arms crossed, and an expression that had been carefully composed into something neutral, but that had, underneath the neutral, something that might have been relief. John climbed off Rhaegar's neck. His legs informed him that they were finished for the day and possibly the week. He stood anyway. "Well," Daenerys said. "Well," John agreed. "You almost fell off twice." "I know, the third time I corrected early. There was a fourth time. The fourth time was more of a controlled slide." She looked at him and then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. She laughed. It was short and it surprised her as much as him, and she put her hand over her mouth for a moment, composing, but it was real. "You're impossible," she said. "Probably," John said, but I stayed on. A week later, Daenerys's chambers, the negotiation was less dramatic than the dragon riding and more difficult in every way that mattered. They sat across a table, not a throne room table, something smaller, more functional, with maps of Westeros and Essos between them and 2 cups of wine that had gone warm and forgotten. The dragons were somewhere overhead. Ghost was outside the door, apparently having made peace with Myrene as a concept. "The Iron Throne is mine," Daenerys said. She said it the way people state gravity, a fact, not an argument. "By inheritance, arguably mine too," Jon said, and watched her jaw set. "I'm not claiming it. I'm making an observation." "Then what do you want?" "I want the North to remain the North. And I want the 7 kingdoms to still exist when winter is over, which means somebody has to deal with what's coming from beyond the wall before anyone can enjoy ruling them." She looked at the map. Her fingers traced a route: Dragonstone, King's Landing, the old path of conquest. "You'd support my claim." "I'd support you ruling if you rule well." He said it without softening. "That's not the same as a blank endorsement of whatever you decide. Most men who support queens do it unconditionally. Most men who support queens aren't also related to them by blood with a competing claim they've chosen not to press." She was quiet for a moment. There was a look on her face that he was learning to read, the one that happened when she'd received information she hadn't predicted and was integrating it without wanting to show the process. He was direct with her in a way her advisors weren't, and he thought she was not entirely sure how to feel about it, but that she found it useful, a muscle that had been going unexercised. "You said the long night is coming," she said. "The White Walkers, you believe this completely?" "Yes." "On what evidence?" "The accounts beyond the wall. The reports from the Night's Watch, which everyone ignores because the Night's Watch has been ignored for 100 years and people have developed the habit. The nature of the legends themselves." He paused. "And a thing I can't explain, which is that I know it the way I know cold, not because someone told me, because I feel it." She considered him carefully. "You know that sounds like madness." "Yes. You know what they said about the Targaryens who claimed certainty based on visions and feelings." "I know exactly what they said." His voice was level. "Which is why I'm not asking you to act on my feeling. I'm asking you to look at the evidence and draw your own conclusion. I'm not my father. I don't want you to believe something because I'm certain. I want you to see it for yourself." The silence stretched between them. The candle on the table had burned low. Outside, Myrene went about its complicated, compromised, slowly rebuilding business. "If I go to Westeros," she said slowly, "and there is no army of the dead, then you still have 3 dragons, an unsullied army, Dothraki outriders, and a trueborn Targaryen ally with northern connections who can help you consolidate. You lose nothing by taking both threats seriously." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're very good at this," she said. "At what?" "At making people think they've been persuaded rather than argued into something." Jon thought about that. "I don't think I argued you into anything you weren't already considering." "No," she admitted. "The slavers won't stop. The cities I've freed will need stability I can't provide from here. And a dragon," she started again. "A dragon is safest in Westeros. They were never meant for this climate." "Westeros is colder," Jon said. "Westeros has mountains, proper ones." She almost smiled. "Rhaegar seemed happy today. He seemed extremely unhappy with me for the first hour." "He seemed happy about the flying," she said. "He tolerates you. I'll take tolerance." Jon looked at the map. At the shape of the continent he'd grown up on, the north stretching like a palm with its fingers pointing at the wall. "We should leave before the fighting season ends." "The sea crossing is better in summer," she nodded. Then quietly, "You're afraid of the sea." "I'm not afraid of it," Jon said with great dignity. "I'm wary of it. Those are different things. You went green looking at the harbor from the pyramid. The light was bad. It was a clear day." "The light," Jon said firmly, "was bad." She looked at him and something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but the possibility of warmth, the way the sky looks just before it changes. She had been lonely for a long time, he realized, not just recently. She had grown up in exile and entered power without ever really being known, and the people around her served or followed or advised, but nobody spoke to her the way you speak to someone you're just meeting for the first time and finding unexpectedly real. He was her family. The last of her family, such as it was. An aunt was not a word that quite covered the complexity of what that meant. He was also, he noted with the part of his mind that catalogued inconvenient information, remarkably difficult not to look at. She was vivid and sharp, and her laugh, the one she'd surprised herself with, had been completely unguarded. This was information he tucked somewhere very deep and planned to leave there. Westeros, then, Daenerys said. Westeros, Jon agreed. They looked at the map together, the candle guttered. Above the pyramid, distantly, they heard the sound of enormous wings, Drogon or Rhaegar, circling in the evening air, already restless for the sky. Chapter 5, The Long Nights, King Dragonstone, then Westeros. Jon is 19. The small council of Queen Cersei Lannister received the joint delegation of Aegon Targaryen and Daenerys Targaryen with the particular courtesy that people deploy when they have decided to say no but want to feel good about themselves while doing it. The letter came back within a week. It was politely worded. It was completely useless. Jon read it twice. He handed it to Daenerys. She read it once, which was enough. She doesn't believe the dead are coming, Daenerys said. This was not a question. She believes the dead are coming, Jon said. She's decided that if they are, they solve her Targaryen problem for her. A pause. She's letting us fight it alone. She's letting the North fight it alone and hoping it costs us enough that we can't threaten her afterward. Daenerys set the letter down with the precise care of someone placing a thing they would very much like to throw. She is not a stupid woman. No, she's also gambling the entire realm on the assumption that whatever comes through the wall can be stopped at the neck. Yes. The neck didn't stop anything the last time. No, it didn't. Jon looked at the map on the table between them. Westeros in its entirety, from the wall to Dorne, every castle and river and road that would mean nothing at all if the dead reached them. We go north without her. And afterward. Afterward, Jon said, we have a conversation with Cersei Lannister about what it costs to watch from the south while the north bleeds. Daenerys looked at him. There was something in her eyes that he'd been noticing more frequently since they arrived in Westeros, a sharpening. A heat that had nothing to do with dragons. He understood it in principle. Power, when it was close enough to touch, did things to people. He was being careful not to let it do those things to him. North, she agreed. Winterfell. 3 weeks later, he had not been home in 2 years. The walls were the same. The stones were the same. The smell of pine and horse and cold air was so exactly the same that it hit Jon somewhere below memory, in the place where the body keeps its oldest information. He stood in the yard and let it wash over him and did not allow himself to feel too much of it, because there was work to do and grief was a luxury he could not afford right now, and Ned was dead. Ned was dead, and someone else had been holding Winterfell in his absence. Sansa had grown into her authority the way some people grow into complicated clothing. Not without difficulty, but with the final result being that it fit perfectly, and you could no longer imagine her in anything else. She stood in the yard when they arrived and looked at Jon and at Daenerys and at the 2 dragons circling overhead, and her expression was the expression of someone who has prepared for this exact moment and is managing the gap between preparation and reality. Jon, she said, Sansa. She embraced him briefly and precisely. Then she pulled back and looked at him the way she sometimes had when they were children and he'd done something she hadn't expected, with the particular attention of someone updating their understanding of another person. You look different, she said. 2 years. It's not the years. Her eyes went to the dragons briefly, then back. The lords are in the great hall. They've been here 3 days waiting. Half of them came because Robb sent word, and half of them came because of, she glanced at Daenerys, the reports from the south. I'll speak to them tonight, Jon said. They want to know who you are. She said it with a particular emphasis, not cruelly, just this is the thing. Tonight, Jon said, they'll know. Sansa held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, the way people nod when they've made a decision about something they're not entirely certain of but have chosen to trust anyway. She turned to Daenerys. Your Grace, welcome to Winterfell, Lady Sansa. Daenerys looked around the yard at the ancient stone, at the godswood visible through the inner gate. It's colder than I expected. It gets worse, Sansa said pleasantly. He told them that evening. All of them, the Mormonts and the Umbers and the Glovers and the Karstarks and the Serwyns and 24 others, every lord of note in the north who could reach Winterfell in time. He stood in the great hall where Ned had stood before him and Ned's father before that, and he said, My name is Aegon Targaryen, and I am the trueborn son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, and I am your lord's sister's son, and I have come home. The silence that followed was the loudest thing John had ever heard. Then old Lady Lyanna Mormont, 12 years old, approximately 4.5 feet tall and more frightening than most men John had met in his life, stood up from her bench. "The North remembers," she said. "Lyanna Stark is remembered. If her son has come home to fight for us, I say we fight with him, and I say we do it now before the sun comes up and we spend another hour arguing about it." She sat back down. Her expression dared the room to disagree with her. The room, being made of lords who were brave men but not stupid ones, chose not to. The pledges came in ones and twos after that, building until they filled the hall, and John stood at the front and received them with the steady composure he had been practicing since he was 5 years old. He felt Daenerys at his left side, present and watching, and Ghost at his right, which was where Ghost had always been. Afterward, in the quiet of Ned's old solar, John could not think of it as his, not yet, perhaps not ever. Arya appeared. She had gotten quieter. He remembered a girl who had been defined by her noise, her movement, her perpetual protest against stillness. What stood in the doorway now was something more like a blade, honed down, precise, with the quality of things that have been through a process that removed everything that wasn't essential. "I heard the speech," she said. "Was it terrible? It was good." She came and sat on the edge of the table in the particular way she had always sat on things, as though chairs were fine but surfaces were more honest. "Egon," she tried the name, made a face. "That's going to take some getting used to. John is fine, it's always been fine." "Jon Snow, secret Targaryen prince." She shook her head. "Old Nan would have loved this." "Old Nan always knew," John said. "She told me when I was 7 that Ghost knew something. She was right." Ghost, who had been lying by the fire, opened one eye at the sound of his name. Arya looked at him, at the sheer enormous whiteness of him, the size he had become. "He got big," she said. "Yes, he looks like something out of a story." "He is something out of a story," John said. He looked at Ghost, at the wolf's red eyes reflecting the fire, and felt something that was not quite presentable enough to be said out loud. Something about having carried a secret for 14 years and the weight of it, and the way that weight had been easier because Ghost was always simply there. Never complicated, never demanding, just there. He always has been. Arya was watching him. She had always been able to see more than people gave her credit for. "You're scared," she said. "Yes, good." She hopped off the table. "Scared means you understand what's at stake. Come on." Sansa made actual food, and Daenerys's people are doing that thing where they stand very formally in doorways, and it's making everyone nervous. John stood and followed his sister, and Ghost padded behind them both, and for a few hours Winterfell was almost what it had been. 4 days later, the Battle of Winterfell the Dead came at midnight, not like an army, or not only like an army. They came like a change in the weather, like the way a storm arrives not with a single dramatic moment but with a gradual alteration of everything, the temperature dropping, the light going wrong. The quality of sound shifting until you realize the world has changed around you while you were looking somewhere else. John felt them before he heard them. That cold instinct he had carried since childhood, the one that belonged below thought, went very quiet and very alert in the way that only happened when something enormous was real. He was on Rhaegar before the horns sounded. The sky above Winterfell was its own country. From up here, the castle was a lit square in an ocean of dark, the torches small and the walls smaller, and the army of the living arranged around it looked impossibly insufficient against the tide that was coming from the north. Whites moved like water, not running exactly but flowing, finding the paths of least resistance with the terrifying patience of things that did not tire and did not feel and did not stop. Daenerys was to his left, Drogon black against the black sky, visible only by the orange glow of his eyes, and the fire he breathed in long, sweeping arcs across the field. "Left flank," Jon shouted and leaned, and Rhaegar went. The dragon fire hit the front ranks of the dead, and the dead burned, which was the good news. The less good news was that the dead kept coming regardless, because the dead had no instinct for self-preservation and no fear of fire, and the Night King had a great many of them and seemed entirely unbothered by their rate of attrition. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting a tide, and tides did not notice casualties. Jon flew 3 passes. 4. Lost count somewhere around the 7th, because counting things while a dragon is banking hard at speed is not practically possible. And also, the situation below had deteriorated from dire to significant crisis. to something that did not have a name yet in the vocabulary of living men. He saw a ghost below, a white shape in the dark moving through the dead with extraordinary violence. He tracked the wolf between passes, a habit too deep to break. He saw the Night King. He was standing at the tree line watching. Not commanding, the dead didn't need commands. They were extensions of him, like fingers, just watching, with the specific quality of attention that an apex predator brings to something it has not yet decided whether to be interested in. He was tall and ancient and cold in a way that was different from the cold of the air around him. His cold was intentional. It was a statement. His eyes found Jon. Jon had been looked at by a great many people in his 19 years. He had been looked at by kings and lords and a dragon who had to decide whether to burn him. He had never, until this moment, been looked at by something that had no interest in him as a person whatsoever, only as an obstacle. The Night King raised one hand. The ice lance was not thrown so much as aimed, a movement that began long before the actual release, calculated with the mathematical precision of something that did not think in words but in trajectories. Jon saw it coming and leaned hard, shouting warning, and Rhaegar moved, not enough. The lance took Rhaegar in the left wing and the world inverted. Jon heard the dragon scream, a sound he had never heard before, immense and raw, and then he was falling, and the ground was coming up fast, and he had exactly enough time to understand what was happening before the snow hit him. He blacked out for 1 second. Maybe two. He came back to cold ground, screaming battle, the sound of something very large crashing somewhere nearby. He was winded. Something in his chest felt wrong, bruised ribs, possibly cracked. He got up anyway. He'd made a habit of getting up. Rhaegar was 30 feet away, on the ground, one wing bent wrong, breathing in great shuddering heaves. Alive. The lance had not been a killing blow. Jon met the dragon's eye and held it for one moment, alive, hurt, grounded, and then he turned away. He did not call Rhaegar back into the air. The wing was damaged and the dragon was in pain, and Jon would not spend him on a vanity. This was a decision he made in the space of half a second and did not revisit. He drew Longclaw. The courtyard of Winterfell was full of the dead, which was a problem, and Jon moved through them with a controlled efficiency that had nothing glamorous about it. He wasn't performing. He was working. Valyrian steel opened whites the way any blade opened anything, and he moved and cut and moved and cut, and Ghost appeared from somewhere and was working beside him in the same wordless way they had always worked beside each other. The Night King was coming. He walked through the battle the way a stone sits in a river, everything moving around him, nothing touching him. The dead parted. The whites made way. He walked across the yard toward Jon with the unhurried certainty of something that has never once doubted the outcome of any encounter. Jon stood and waited, Ghost pressed against his side, just once. The wolf's shoulder against Jon's leg, warm and solid and real. "I know," Jon said. The Night King stopped 8 feet away. He had no weapon. He did not need one. He had raised the dead on the field of the Battle of the Bastards from 300 yards, and Jon did not particularly want to see what he could do at arm's reach. Jon didn't give him the chance to show him. He moved. Valyrian steel and the Night King's armored forearm met with a sound like a bell, and Jon understood immediately that whatever the Night King was, he was not slow. He was ancient and vast and alien in his intelligence, but he was not slow. He caught Longclaw's second stroke with his palm, which should have cost him a hand and didn't, and then he hit Jon in the chest with something that was not quite a punch, more a wave of cold, directional, focused, and Jon went backward into the wall. He stayed conscious. Barely. He came off the wall before the world had fully returned, because staying against the wall was worse than moving. He came in low this time, inside the Night King's reach, and drove Longclaw up, and something hit the Night King from his blind side. Jon did not see it happen. He felt the shift in the Night King's attention, the flicker of something he'd never expected to feel from this creature, which was surprise, and then a sound, and then the Night King was staggering, and Jon drove Longclaw home before he'd consciously processed what had changed. The Night King shattered, not dramatically, not slowly. He simply ceased, the cold exploding outward and then collapsing inward, and the whites stopped, all of them at once, like candles in a sudden wind, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Jon had ever heard. He stood in the courtyard with Longclaw in his hand and ice crystals melting in his hair and looked at where the Night King had been. Arya stepped out of the shadow at the base of the wall. She had a blade in her hand, small, dark, impossibly sharp. She looked at Jon. "You slowed him down." She said, which was both tactful and accurate and was precisely the kind of thing Arya had always said when she'd done something extraordinary and didn't want to fuss about it. "You killed him," Jon said. "We killed him," she said. "Don't do the hero thing, it's irritating." Jon looked around the courtyard, at the shapes on the ground that had been dead a moment ago and were dust now. At Rhaegar, still breathing, wings splayed wrong, watching them with an eye the size of a shield. At the smoke from the torches drifting up into a sky that was becoming, very slowly, less dark. "Ghost," he said. He heard it in the word before he'd finished saying it. The wrong quality to the air. The absence of warm weight against his left side. He turned. Ghost was at the base of the wall. He had positioned himself there while Jon fought the Night King, put his body between Jon and the whites that had been coming from the left, the ones Jon hadn't seen, the ones he'd been too focused on the Night King to track. He had dealt with them. He had dealt with all of them. He was breathing. Jon crossed the courtyard in a number of steps he could not afterward have counted. He went to his knees in the snow beside the wolf. Ghost looked at him. The red eyes were dim and present, not panicked, not afraid. Ghost had never been afraid of anything in his life. He looked at Jon with the specific quality he had always had, the quality that Jon had spent 14 years thinking of as simply Ghost, the look that meant, "I see you, all of you, and I'm here." Jon put his hands on the white fur. His hands were shaking. He didn't try to stop them. "You didn't have to," he said, which was both true and completely beside the point, and he knew it. Ghost breathed out, slow. "Even you always did," Jon said. "You always just—" He stopped, started again. "Since the beginning. Since I was 5 and you picked me specifically out of everyone, and I never understood why. I still don't understand why, I just knew it was." Another stop. "You were the one thing that was only ever mine, no politics, no secret, no explanation required, just you." Ghost was still. Still breathing. Jon kept his hands on the fur and felt the warmth of him and tried to hold it. Arya sat down in the snow on the other side of the wolf. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on Ghost's side and was quiet, because Arya had always understood what silence was for. Ghost's breathing slowed, stopped. The courtyard of Winterfell was very quiet. The battle was over. The dead were gone. The sky in the east had the pale gray quality of a world that intends, reluctantly, to continue. Somewhere above them, Drogon circled and called, a sound like a question with no answer. Jon kept his hands on Ghost's fur until it went cold. He did not move for a long time after that, the day after the North had won. This was the accurate sentence, and everyone said it, and it was true, and it contained almost none of what had actually happened. What had actually happened was that 10,000 soldiers were dead, and another 30,000 were wounded to varying degrees, and Winterfell had lost its eastern wall and most of its stables, and Rhaegar's left wing would take months to heal. And Sir Davos Seaworth had held the gates for 3 hours in the dark with 80 men, and Lady Lyanna Mormont had taken 7 whites by herself before the 8th one got her, and the pyres were still burning when the sun came up. Jon moved through the day with the methodical steadiness of someone who has chosen activity over grief because grief is not, currently, something he can afford. He spoke to the lords. He organized the injured. He walked the walls with Sansa and discussed what could be rebuilt and what would have to wait. He found Daenerys at Rhaegar's side, tending the wing with a care that surprised him and then, on reflection, didn't. "He'll fly again," she said, not looking up. "The wing will knit. 3 months, maybe 4. Good. He was very brave. He was hurt and grounded and still didn't leave." Jon looked at the dragon's great eye, watching them. "That's not brave, that's just character." Daenerys looked at him. She had the particular expression of someone about to say something about Ghost, reconsidering and deciding that silence was wiser. He was grateful for the silence. "You should sleep," she said instead. "Later, Jon, later," he said. He said it gently, and she didn't push. He went to the Godswood at dusk. He went alone, which he almost never did anymore, and he sat under the heart tree by the black pool where Ned had sat before him, and he thought about all the things he could not say to anyone. He thought about Ghost and the 14 years of loyalty that needed no explanation. He thought about the fact that the wolf had known, from the first moment in the snow outside Winterfell, that Jon was going to need someone who just showed up. No agenda, no fear, no need to understand. Just showed up. He thought about his father, who had believed in prophecy and destiny and the certainty of his own importance. He thought about how easy it would be, sitting in the Godswood of Winterfell after surviving the long night, to decide that this meant something specific about himself. to believe that he was the prince that was promised, to let the legend calcify around him. He thought, 10,000 people died. Lyanna Mormont died. Ghost died. The cost of the long night was paid in full, and most of the people who paid it were not named in any prophecy. They were just people who showed up. He thought, that's the whole point, isn't it? That's what Rhaegar missed. It was never about the one person. It was about everyone who showed up. He sat for a while longer. The pool was dark and still and reflected the first stars. Then he stood. He had things to do. Westeros was still broken, Cersei still sat on the Iron Throne, Robb was still in the field, and the work of building something worth living in had not done itself while they were busy surviving. He had made a promise to Ghost, in the only way you could make a promise to a creature that needed no words, that the showing up would continue, that he would be worth what it had cost. He walked back through the godswood, and the weirwood watched him go with its red eyes, and the wind off the moors was cold and clean and familiar, and Jon Snow went back to work. Chapter 6. The Price of Dragons. The Reach. 2 months after the Battle of Winterfell, power, Jon had observed over the course of his 19 years, was not a thing that changed people so much as it was a thing that revealed them. Strip away the uncertainty, the scarcity, the need to negotiate and accommodate and manage. Give someone everything they need to simply act, and what they did next was the truest version of them available. He had thought about this a great deal before arriving in Essos. He had thought about it in Meereen when he watched Daenerys navigate the slaver lords with a combination of dragon threat and negotiated compromise that was genuinely sophisticated. He had filed it as, she understands that fire is more useful as a deterrent than a tool. He had been partly right. He had missed the part that followed. She understood it right up until she didn't. The march south from Winterfell had taken 6 weeks and carried with it the quality of aftermath, the particular flatness of people who have survived something enormous and are now required immediately to do something else enormous without quite enough time in between to become whole again. The army moved. The soldiers marched. They ate when food was available and slept when stopping was possible, and nobody talked much, because there are things too big for talking about when you're still inside them. The political situation south of the Neck was, in the diplomatic language of Sir Davos Seaworth, complicated as 7 hells and twice as hot. In plain language, Cersei still held King's Landing. Approximately half of the Westerosi lords had sided with her, a quarter had come over to the Targaryen cause after the long night, and the remaining quarter were watching from their castles with their gates shut, hoping to determine which way the wind was blowing before committing to anything that might later require explaining. Robb arrived at the Crossroads Inn on the Kingsroad with 11,000 men, and the expression of someone who has been in a field for a year and has complicated feelings about it. He looked at Jon. At Jon's position at the front of the column beside Daenerys, clearly co-equal rather than subordinate, at the way the lords around him deferred, at the silver-gold quality of the Targaryen banners snapping in the wind above, mixed with the direwolf of Stark. Egon, Robb said. Testing it the way Arya had, landing differently. Jon said. Still Jon, always Jon. Robb looked at him for another moment, then he crossed the distance between them and embraced him with the force of 11,000 men's worth of relief. I heard about Ghost, Robb said into his shoulder. Jon held on for a moment. I know. I'm sorry. Me too. They separated. Robb looked at Daenerys with the specific expression of a man meeting someone he has been trying to form an opinion about from second-hand reports for months and is now being confronted with the reality in person. Daenerys looked back with the expression of a woman who was accustomed to being assessed and had stopped finding it interesting. Your Grace, Robb said, correctly, courteously. Lord Stark. She paused. Shall we discuss the siege? Robb looked at Jon. Jon gave him the look that said, yes, she's always like this, and also, it's not as bad as it sounds, and also, we'll talk properly later. Robb, who had always been able to read Jon with the fluency of long practice, nodded. The siege, he agreed. The burning of Crakehall happened 3 weeks after Robb's arrival, and afterward Jon would mark it as the moment he understood that what was coming could not be avoided, only managed, and possibly not even that. Lord Crakehall had refused to yield. This was his right, technically, within the rules of siege warfare that everyone observed when they were convenient. He had also, during the long night, sent Cersei a detailed accounting of the Targaryen army's strength and movements, which was discovered in captured correspondence. which was not within any rules anyone had ever written down but was understood to be the kind of thing that ended badly for the person who did it. Daenerys had given him 3 days to open his gates. He had not opened his gates. She had flown Drogon over Crackhall's walls on the 4th morning, and the fires she set were controlled, the outer walls. The towers, nothing that spread to the town below, the small folk evacuated under her terms before the first flame. It was, by the standards of what dragons could do if their rider didn't care, restrained, precise. The Lord fled into the burning keep and did not come out, Jon had watched from the ground. He had stood in the field with his hands at his sides and watched the fire climb the walls of a castle that had stood for 400 years, and felt something cold settle in his chest that was not the winter cold he was used to. It was not what she'd burned. It was the look on her face when she landed. He had seen satisfaction before. He had seen relief and triumph and the particular exhausted peace of someone who has finished a hard thing. He had not, until that morning, seen Daenerys look at destruction and find it beautiful. She caught him watching. The expression left her face immediately, replaced by the composed queen he had come to know, and she said, "It was necessary." "I know," Jon said. "He was a traitor, I know, Jon, I know." He said again, and the repetition landed differently the 3rd time, and she heard what he wasn't saying, and she looked at him for a long moment before she walked away. He stood in the field and watched the towers fall. 3 days later, the War Council Sansa had the gift of saying difficult things in a way that made it impossible to argue without arguing against the facts themselves, which was simultaneously admirable and deeply inconvenient when you were the one the difficult things were being said to. "Hornvale is refusing to negotiate," she said, at the council table in their captured camp. "Lord Clifton says he will not deal with Dragonfire. He has sent word to 4 other lords saying the same. We are losing the middle ground, the lords who were not committed to Cersei but who might have come to us. They're going back behind their gates." Jon looked at the map. At the cluster of castles between them and King's Landing, each one now reconsidering. "Because of Crackhall," he said. "Because of Crackhall," Sansa confirmed. She said it without accusation because she was far too careful for accusation. She said it as information, which somehow made it worse. Tyrion Lannister, who had arrived 3 weeks ago from King's Landing under a flag of negotiation that he claimed was sincere, and which Jon suspected was partly sincere, and partly Tyrion being a man who preferred to be on the winning side and was updating his assessment of which side that was. Leaned forward over his wine. He had the manner of someone permanently on the edge of saying something that would either solve everything or make it worse, and a long career of not knowing which outcome he was about to produce. "What Her Grace did was legal," he said. "It was also exactly the wrong message to send to lords who are deciding whether surrendering to a Targaryen involves the same risks as losing to one." He paused. "Those are different questions. People need to believe they're different questions." "She knows that," Jon said. "She knows it when she's thinking about it," Tyrion said carefully. "She doesn't always think about it when Drogon is available." The table was quiet. Sir Davos, who had the quality of a good compass, reliable, honest, pointing consistently at true north regardless of what the people around him preferred, looked at Jon with the steady expression of a man who has made peace with saying things his lord does not want to hear. "She's going to King's Landing," Davos said. "Not yet, but, the way things are going, if Cersei doesn't yield, and Cersei hasn't yielded anything in her life that I've seen, she's going to go to King's Landing and she's going to—" "I know," Jon said, with the city full of, "I know, Davos." The silence stretched. Outside the tent, someone was shouting something about horses, which was the eternal ambient noise of any army camp, an army being largely composed of people arguing about horses. "What do you want?" Sansa asked, quietly, directly, the stark way Jon looked at her. "What?" "Not what you think is right, not what the realm needs, not what the small folk deserve. What do you want?" "Because I think," she said, with the precision of someone who has been thinking about this for longer than this conversation, "that you've spent so long knowing what you are that you've never quite decided what you want to do with it. And now you need to decide. So what do you want?" Jon was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Tyrion refilled his wine and Davos looked at the map, and Sansa waited with the patience of someone who learned patience the hard way and has made it into a weapon. "I want it to be the last war," Jon said finally. "I want there to be somewhere safe for people to sleep at night. I want the long night to have meant something beyond just the fact that we survived it. And the throne? Sansa asked. I don't want it, Jon said. He said it plainly, the way he said most true things. I never did, it's not, he stopped, started again. Ned used to say that the man who wants power least is often the man most suited to hold it. I think he was right. I also think the problem with that idea is that the man who wants power least is the man most likely to hand it to someone who's wanting of it is a warning sign he's chosen to overlook. Another silence. Tyrion looked at him with an expression that was somewhat unusual on Tyrion's face, something resembling respect unfiltered by irony. So what do you do about it? Tyrion asked. I talked to her, Jon said. Again, and this time I don't stop at a confrontation. This time I tell her exactly what happens if she doesn't listen. Robb, who had been sitting at the far end of the table saying nothing, which for Robb required considerable effort, looked up. What happens? Jon looked at his brother. At the man who had called him family since he was 9 years old, who had ridden to war under his own banner and bled for it, who was sitting in a command tent in the Reach when he should have been home. I stopped standing beside her, Jon said, and I stand somewhere else instead. Nobody argued. They had all, apparently, been waiting for him to arrive at that sentence. It was not a comfortable feeling, being the last person to reach your own conclusion. That evening, Daenerys's tent, he had been in this conversation before in his head. He had been in it, on and off for 3 months, ever since Crakehall, ever since the look on her face, ever since the lords started closing their gates. He had planned it carefully, which was not a thing he normally bothered to do with difficult conversations, because careful planning tended to collapse on first contact with another person's actual response. But this one mattered enough to plan. None of the plan survived the first 2 minutes. She knew why he'd come. She had known, he suspected, for days. Daenerys Targaryen was not a woman who missed things. She was sometimes a woman who chose not to acknowledge them, which was a different failure mode and in some ways a more dangerous one. She was standing when he arrived, which meant she had not intended to make this easy by sitting. You're going to tell me that Crakehall was a mistake, she said before he could speak. I'm going to tell you that Crakehall revealed something, Jon said. And that I've been watching what it revealed for 3 months, and I need to say what I see before it gets worse. She turned. Her expression was the controlled one, but underneath the control, something else. Something that had the quality of someone who has been waiting for a fight and is not entirely sure whether they want to win it. Say it then, she said. You're afraid, he said. Not of losing, of what winning looks like. You've been fighting for the throne your whole life, and now it's close enough to touch, and you're discovering that what's underneath the wanting it is terror, because what if you get it and it still isn't enough? What if it doesn't fill the thing it was supposed to fill? He kept his voice level. Not cruel, he was not trying to wound her. And when that fear gets big enough, you use Drogon instead of thinking because at least Drogon is decisive, at least fire makes things simple. The silence that followed was its own kind of fire. You have no idea, she said quietly. The control was still there, but it was thinner now, and underneath it something old and genuinely wounded. What it was. What it was to grow up knowing what I was owed and watching every person I trusted either die or betray me. I have done things, I have freed people, I have built things, I have survived things that would have broken anyone. I know, Jon said. Then don't, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on it, which he knew she'd hate. Don't stand there and tell me that I'm afraid. As though fear is the simplest, most embarrassing explanation for everything I am. I'm not saying fear explains everything you are. I'm saying I can see where it's making decisions, and those decisions are losing us the war. He moved slightly, so he was looking at her directly rather than across the table. You are the most extraordinary person I have met. That is not flattery, I mean it as an accurate statement of fact. But extraordinary people are not immune from making extraordinary mistakes, and the specific mistake you are making right now is one I recognize. She looked at him. Something shifted, a question forming. What mistake? My father's, Jon said. The word landed in the quiet of the tent and stayed there. Rhaegar, she said. He was certain he was right, about the prophecy, about the necessity of what he did, about the ends justifying the means. He wasn't wrong that the long night was coming, we've proved that now. He may even have been right that the bloodline needed preserving, but he made every decision from the assumption of his own correctness, and that assumption cost thousands of lives and 20 years of war, and even if everything he believed was true, the cost was real. The people were real. Jon paused. The small folk of King's Landing are real. The people in those castles that are closing their gates because they're afraid of what you'll do to them, they are real." She was very still. He had learned to read her stillness. There were several kinds, and this one was the kind where she was actually listening, processing, rebuilding her understanding around new information. She was doing it. He could see her doing it, and then she stopped. He could see that too. The moment where the information reached something rigid, something that would not bend, and instead of rebuilding around it, she began constructing reasons why it didn't apply. "What I do," she said carefully, "is in service of a better world. Every action I take is aimed at breaking the systems that created the slavery, the cruelty, the 1,000 years of deaneries. And if lords who collaborated with Cersei and provided intelligence that could have gotten our soldiers killed, deaneries." His voice was gentle and immovable. "I know what you believe. I believe most of it too. I'm telling you that the method is becoming the message, and the message is obey or burn, and that message will not build what you want to build." She looked at him. Her jaw was set. She had heard him. She had understood him. She was going to disagree anyway, which was her absolute right, and which was also the thing he had been most afraid of. "What would you have me do?" The question had an edge to it. "Negotiate endlessly, wait for people who have never respected Targaryen rule to simply decide to accept it." "I have dragons, Jon. I have an army. I have the right." "Having the right and using it wisely are not the same thing. You sound like a Meister." "I sound like someone who watched 10,000 people die and doesn't want the world they died for to become something they wouldn't recognize." The silence after that was very long. "If I take King's Landing," she said finally, "the way I intend to take it, will you stand with me?" He had known this question was coming. He had been living inside it for weeks. "No," he said. Something moved across her face. It was not anger, not yet. It was the expression of someone recalibrating a world they had believed they understood. "Then where will you stand?" "Somewhere that isn't ash," Jon said. "I'll stand in the north. I'll hold it for the people who fought and died there. I'll rebuild what the long night destroyed. And I will spend every day hoping you find a way to rule the south that doesn't require burning it first. You're choosing the north over the realm." "I'm choosing the people in it over the concept of ruling it," Jon said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. There was something in her expression he had not seen before and could not fully name, not hatred, not contempt, not the clean anger that would have been easier. Something sadder and more complicated, something that might have been grief if she had allowed herself to feel grief. "You have a claim," she said, quietly, as though she was saying it to herself as much as to him. "A better claim than mine, technically, if your legitimacy holds. If you stood against me, I'm not standing against you." His voice was firm. "I'm telling you where I will not stand. That's different, is it?" "Yes." She crossed to the tent entrance and said one word to the guard outside. Jon heard the sound of enormous wings before he understood what she'd done. Drogon landed in the field outside the tent with the controlled violence of a creature that had felt its rider's anger and arrived accordingly. Rhaegar, who had been resting 200 yards away with his healing wings still bound, not fully mended, functional enough to fly short distances, raised his head at the sound. The two dragons looked at each other across the dark field. Jon came out of the tent and stood beside Daenerys, and for a moment they stood together and apart in the way that people stand when everything between them is still true and has become, somehow, impossible at the same time. Drogon was fire and night, vast and terrible, his orange eyes moving between his rider and the other dragon with an intelligence that read the room with better accuracy than most humans could manage. Rhaegar was smaller, still healing, his bronze-green scales dull in the dark, but he had risen to his feet, and his eyes were on Jon, and there was nothing diminished about him. The two dragons regarded each other. Drogon exhaled. "Not fire, breath, hot and sulphurous," a statement. Rhaegar answered with the same. They did not fight. They were not going to fight. Some understanding passed between them that was older than any human conflict, some calculus that two creatures of the same blood and different riders had worked out in a language Jon could feel but not translate. They assessed each other, found each other real. And then Drogon looked away first, not in submission but in the manner of something that has seen what it needed to see and is done with the looking. Rhaegar sat back down. His eyes remained on Jon. Jon was aware of Daenerys beside him. Of the 3 feet of air between them that felt like more. Of everything said and unsaid, the conversation they'd just had and the 100 conversations before it, the months in Meereen and Dragonstone and the long march south, and the first time she'd laughed at him in a courtyard with Rhaegar's mud on his face. I don't want to be your enemy, he said. Then don't be, her voice was rough. Stand with me. I can't stand with you and be honest. I can't do both at the same time. Other people manage. Other people aren't me, she looked at him. One last look, the kind that catalogs everything, that takes inventory because it suspects it might need to. He looked back. He did not look away. You are, she said quietly, extraordinarily inconvenient. I know, John said. I've been told. She walked back inside the tent. He listened to the tent flap, fall closed, and stood in the dark field between the two dragons for a while longer. Rhaegar was watching him. John crossed the field and stood beside the dragon and put his hand on the great scaled neck, and Rhaegar lowered his head slightly, and they stood there in the dark and the cooling autumn air. Right, John said, to the dragon and the night and the shape of what came next. Now the hard part. He had made his choice. He had made it the way he made all his choices, looking at the evidence, waiting until he was certain, and then refusing to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. He did not know yet what it would cost. He knew that it would cost something because everything real did. He thought about Ned, who had made a promise to a dying sister and kept it for 17 years at considerable personal expense, and had never once suggested it was anything other than the only thing he could have done. He thought, I understand now, not the specific shape of it, but the feeling. The point at which keeping faith with someone requires you to tell them something they don't want to hear, and telling them doesn't change anything, and you do it anyway because the alternative is to be someone you cannot recognize. He had told her. She had not changed. The world was going to have to change instead. He stayed with Rhaegar until the dragon slept, which took a while because Rhaegar was not, constitutionally, a creature who let things go quickly. When the great breathing finally settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, John walked back to the camp. He found Robb outside his tent, awake, with no good reason to be awake except that he was a Stark, and Starks woke at midnight when things were wrong because they had developed, over many generations, a reliable sense for wrongness. How did it go? Robb asked. John considered his answer. Honestly. He said, which was the only way it could have gone. And now we wait and see what she decides. He looked south where King's Landing sat on its hills behind its walls, waiting, and we hope she surprises us. Robb looked at him with the expression he'd had since they were boys, the one that said, I don't fully understand what you're carrying, but I understand that it's heavy and I'm here. Come and eat something. Davos made a stew that's mostly hot water and optimism, but it's warm. John almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the direction of one. Davos's optimism has gotten us this far. Aye, Robb put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Come on, they went inside. The fire was low and the stew was exactly as described, and it was warm, which was enough. Outside, in the dark, the two dragons slept in their separate places, and the stars turned overhead, and somewhere in a tent that John could not see, Daenerys Targaryen was deciding something. Chapter 7. The song ends King's Landing. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Cersei Lannister did not go quietly, because Cersei Lannister had never done anything quietly in her life, and she saw no particular reason to begin now simply because the situation had become untenable. She went loudly and badly, and at considerable cost to the city's nerves, which was very much in keeping with everything else she had ever done. The details were these. The city's grain merchants had opened their gates to the Targaryen forces 2 weeks after Jon's confrontation with Daenerys, because merchants understood the direction of inevitability better than lords did, and the direction was clear. 3 of Cersei's most reliable supporters had quietly withdrawn their forces during the night, which was the military equivalent of sliding out of a party before anyone could ask you to help clean up. The city's guilds had sent a joint delegation to the Targaryen camp offering to negotiate terms, which left Cersei holding a city whose population had, without quite staging a formal revolt, simply stopped cooperating. What ended it was the wildfire. Jon had known about the caches. Tyrion had told him, weeks ago, with the specific grimness of someone sharing information that they wish they did not have. The Mad King's green fire, stored beneath the city in quantities that nobody had ever quite gotten around to removing. Because removing wildfire was itself a project that could go catastrophically wrong, and there had always been something else to deal with first. Cersei had apparently been thinking about the wildfire for some time. It was Jaime who stopped it. Jon did not know the full details. Nobody outside the Red Keep knew the full details, and the people inside the Red Keep who had been present were not inclined to discuss it. What he knew was this. Jaime Lannister had walked into the throne room while his sister was giving the order, and what happened next was between them, and afterwards Cersei Lannister was no longer giving orders. The city had opened its gates the following morning. Jaime had found Jon in the camp before the gates were fully open and had looked at him with the expression of a man who has done something he cannot undo and has made a complete and total peace with it. He had said without preamble, "She was going to burn them, all of them." "I know," Jon said. "I stopped her." "I know." A pause. Jaime looked at him. "You're not going to ask?" "No, most people would ask." "Most people weren't raised by Eddard Stark," Jon said. "He taught me that there are decisions a man makes that belong only to him and the gods, and other people asking about them is just nosiness dressed up as concern." He met Jaime's eyes steadily. "You stopped the burning. The city is safe, that's what matters." Jaime Lannister looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "You're nothing like what I expected," he said. "People say that," Jon said. "I've never quite decided if it's a compliment." "It is," Jaime said, "for whatever that's worth coming from me." "More than you think," Jon said honestly. "Probably more than you'd be comfortable knowing." They left it there. The city gates opened. Jon rode in. The great hall of the Red Keep, the Iron Throne, was the ugliest thing Jon had ever seen. He had known, intellectually, what it was. 1,000 swords melted together by Balerion the Black Dread, the dragon of Aegon the Conqueror, hammered into the shape of a seat by 3 days of continuous dragonfire. He had read the descriptions. He had understood the symbolism. A throne built from the weapons of defeated enemies, so sharp in places that kings had cut themselves on it, the old lords saying that the throne itself judged whether a king was worthy. Looking at it in person, he thought, it is enormous and jagged and deeply uncomfortable looking, and it smells faintly of old metal. And whoever decided that this was the symbol of ultimate power in the known world had an extremely specific idea of what power was supposed to feel like. He did not sit in it. He stood in front of it, which was where he intended to remain. The lords had been assembling for 4 days, everyone who could reach King's Landing in that time, everyone who had come to the Targaryen camp or surrendered peacefully or simply been close enough to attend. There were perhaps 80 of them in the hall, which was more than enough to represent the shape of the realm. They stood in 2 loose groupings that had formed without anyone formally organizing them, which told Jon more about the current political reality than any report could. Those who had come over to Daenerys and those who had not. And the considerable number standing exactly in the middle who had been doing mental arithmetic for 4 days and were still working through it. Daenerys entered from the left. Jon had seen her 3 times since their confrontation, formally at the camp, for the purposes of coordinating the city's surrender. They had been entirely professional, entirely correct. They had spoken to each other with the courtesy of 2 people who are being very careful, which was its own kind of language. She looked at him now across the hall. He looked back. There was no hostility in it. That was perhaps the most complicated part. There had never been hostility between them, not really, and there wasn't now. What there was between them was truth, uncomfortable and mutual. They had looked at each other and seen something real, and real things were sometimes incompatible with each other, and incompatibility was not the same as enmity. Jon stepped forward. "My name," he said into the silence of the hall, "is Aegon Targaryen. I am the true-born son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Lady Lyanna Stark of Winterfell. I was kept secret for 19 years to protect my life. I have not pressed that claim publicly until this moment because I did not believe it was the right moment until now." The hall was very quiet. 80 lords held their breath with the collective unity of people who are about to hear something that will change their situation. "By the laws of succession of House Targaryen and the customs of the 7 kingdoms," Jon continued, "my claim to the Iron Throne supersedes that of my aunt, Queen Daenerys. I have a better claim. Most of you can do the mathematics. I am not going to pretend otherwise." He heard someone shift on his left. He did not look. He kept his eyes on the room. "I'm also not going to use it." The silence shifted in quality. 80 lords experiencing the specific sensation of having prepared for one outcome and been given another. "I am going to propose something instead. I want a great council, not the rubber stamp kind that existed to make decisions already made, but a real one with real authority, meeting at regular intervals, representing the lords of this realm. I want a queen who rules the South by law and by counsel, not by the threat of what her dragons will do to those who disagree. I want the North to be free, fully, formally, permanently free, independent of the Iron Throne, as it was before Aegon the Conqueror came south, and as it has been in spirit every day since, whatever the maps say." He paused. "Let that land. In exchange for these things, I will swear publicly that I press no claim now or ever. My children, if I have them, will press no claim. The Targaryen question will be settled, not by conquest, but by agreement, witnessed by every lord in this room." He looked at Daenerys. "Those are my terms." He said, "Queen Daenerys may accept them, in which case the realm gets peace, or she may refuse them, in which case I will press my claim, and we will find out whether 80 lords prefer a queen whose method is fire or a king whose method is asking first." A very long silence. Somewhere outside, a bird was doing something cheerful and entirely inappropriate to the gravity of the moment. Daenerys looked at him. He could not read her face. She had the controlled one on, the best version of it, the one that gave away nothing at all. He knew her well enough now to know that the absence of expression was itself an expression. She was thinking very hard and intended to finish thinking before she spoke. It took approximately 30 seconds. Jon counted them. He was, under the circumstances, very glad he had gotten good at waiting. "A great council," she said. "With real authority," Jon said. "Yes, meeting when? Twice yearly, more in crisis. And the North, independent, completely, I will be its lord or its king. That's the North's business, not the South's. In exchange, I will support your rule, send forces if the realm is threatened, maintain the roads and the trade. Everything a kingdom does for its neighbor without the obligation of a vassal." She looked at the Iron Throne behind him. At the ugly, sharp, enormous thing that had been the point of so much of her life. He wondered what she saw when she looked at it now, whether it looked different from the outside of wanting it than it had from the inside. "You planned this," she said, not an accusation. Closer to admiration, filtered through exasperation. "I've been thinking about it since Myrine," Jon said honestly. "I didn't know how it would need to work until 3 weeks ago, since our argument, since I understood what you were deciding, yes." Another pause, she looked at the lords. At the 80 people doing their mathematics. She was doing mathematics of her own, and she was fast, and Jon watched her arrive at the answer. She could refuse. She could call on Drogon. She could turn this into a power struggle and win it by fire, and then she would be the ruler of a kingdom that resented and feared her, held together by the threat of what the dragon would do, and Jon would be what? Dead, probably. Which was a significant personal downside. Or he would press his claim, and the lords would follow him, and she would have a war she would win physically and lose politically, and the realm would burn for it. She was not a stupid woman. She was, in the deepest parts of herself, someone who had genuinely wanted to build something better. The something better was harder to build than she'd thought, and the difficulty had been pushing her toward the easier path, and Jon had named that path, and she had heard him, and the Great Council must have genuine power to refuse the monarch's decisions, she said. Not merely advisory. Jon had not expected her to negotiate. He should have. She was always going to negotiate. That was who she was when she was thinking clearly. He felt something that was not quite relief but lived in the same neighborhood. "Agreed," he said. "And I want a lord from each of the 7 regions on the council, not appointed by the crown, elected by their peers." "Agreed. And the North's trade agreements must be renegotiated separately, not assumed to continue on old terms. Sansa will enjoy that conversation enormously." Jon said, and for one moment Daenerys almost smiled. "I imagine she will." She was quiet for a moment, then very carefully, in the tone of someone making a decision they have fully made, "I accept your terms." The hall exhaled. 80 lords and their collective arithmetic arrived simultaneously at the same answer. "This works. This is the shape of something that might actually work." Jon looked at Daenerys. She looked at him. They were on the same side of this in a way they had not been for months. Not the same position, not the same vision, but the same outcome. It was not the same as agreement. It was better than agreement. It was 2 people who understood each other's limits, finding the place their limits could coexist. "Well," said Tyrion Lannister, from somewhere in the middle of the room, breaking the silence in the way Tyrion broke most silences, with the air of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment and intends to enjoy it properly. "Shall we write this down before anyone changes their mind?" 6 days later, outside the city, Jon found her at Drogon's side at dawn, which was where she went when she was thinking. He had learned this about her the way you learn the habits of someone you have spent months trying to understand, not because they told you, but because you paid attention. He did not have a speech. He had decided not to bring one. Speeches were for halls with 80 lords in them. This was just two people. She heard him approach and did not turn. Drogon was awake, orange eyes finding Jon immediately, assessing and dismissing with the dragon's particular economy. Rhaegar was somewhere above them, recovered enough to fly freely now. His wing healed through the long weeks of siege, and he had taken to early morning flights that Jon did not join because Rhaegar seemed to want the air to himself in the mornings, which Jon respected. "You're leaving." Daenerys said, "Yes." When, this morning, she turned. She looked different in the early light, not older exactly, but more present. The composure was still there, but it was wearing it differently, the way people wear formal clothes when they've stopped performing in them and are just wearing them because it's what they put on. "The council will need," she began. "Sansa will represent the North until we have elections." Jon said, "She'll be better at it than I would. She actually likes councils. And you, I'll come when I'm needed. I will always come when I'm needed." He meant it completely. "That's not in question." She looked at him. He looked back. There had been a time, somewhere in Meereen, when this specific kind of looking at each other had contained the possibility of becoming something else. That possibility was still there, technically, in the way that certain paths remained theoretically walkable long after you'd taken a different road. He acknowledged it and left it where it was. She did the same. He could see her doing it. "I don't regret any of it," she said. It came out quietly, as though she was testing the truth of it and finding it held. "Even the parts I got wrong, even Crake I would change things, but I don't regret being what I am." "You shouldn't," Jon said. "What you are is considerable. You're going to be insufferably reasonable about this, aren't you?" "Probably. I find that extremely irritating." "I know," he almost smiled. "You've mentioned it." She reached out and took his hand briefly, not romantically, not dramatically, just the grip of one person to another that said, "This happened and it was real and I know you." Then she let go. "The realm will be better for what you proposed," she said. "I know that. I didn't want to know it and now I do, which is your fault." "I'll accept that responsibility," Jon said. "Go home, Jon Snow." He went. The Kingsroad, heading north. Robb rode with him as far as the Trident. This was not necessary, logistically, since Robb's seat was in a different direction, and his wife had been waiting for him for the better part of a year, and there was considerable rebuilding to do in Riverrun that was not going to accomplish itself. But Robb had declared that he was riding to the Trident, and nobody had argued, because nobody argued with Robb Stark when he said he was going somewhere. They rode in companionable quiet, which was the best kind. The Kingsroad in late autumn had the particular quality of things winding down, fields stripped and turned, the trees bare-shouldered, the sky the clear, cold blue that precedes the gray of winter. It was not a sad landscape. It was a finished one, a landscape between one thing and the next. "Sansa will run rings around everyone in that council chamber," Robb said at one point. "Yes, she'll hate being away from Winterfell. She'll love it," Jon said. "She just won't admit it. That's the Tully in her." Robb glanced at him. "Are you all right?" Jon thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "Not entirely," he said. "Ask me again in the spring." "Fair enough." They reached the Trident at midday. The river was high with autumn rain and moved fast and dark between its banks. Jon looked at it. "This is where he died," he said. It was the first time he had said it out loud here at the place itself. "Rhaegar." "Yes." Jon looked at the water. At the place where the Ruby Ford was, where a man who had believed in prophecy and dragons and the turning of the age had met Robert Baratheon's hammer in the middle of a river. "I've thought about him my whole life and I never figured out whether I would have liked him. And now," Jon considered, "I think I would have found him fascinating. I think he would have driven me absolutely mad." He paused. "I think he meant well. I think meaning well is not sufficient, and he never quite learned that, and a great many people paid for the lesson." He looked at the water a moment longer. "I think he would have been proud of how this ended, and I think he would have been completely wrong about why." Robb looked at him. "He'd think the prophecy was fulfilled," Jon said. "He'd think this was all according to some plan. He'd see the pattern and miss the people." He turned from the river. "Ned saw the people, every time." Robb was quiet for a moment. "He'd be proud of you," he said. "Ned, I think he'd be relieved, mostly, that it didn't end the way it could have. It didn't end the way it could have because 10,000 people showed up in the dark and held the line." Jon said, And because Arya appeared from nowhere with a knife, and because you rode south for a year in a war you didn't start, and because Davos believes in things that probably don't deserve his belief and then turns out to be right. He swung up onto his horse. The story isn't about me, Robb. I spent 19 years being told I was a secret, and I think that was actually the most accurate thing anyone ever said. I'm a detail in someone else's story. The story is everyone else's. Robb looked at him from horseback with the expression of a man who wants to argue and suspects he'd lose. That's a very modest thing to say for a man who just renegotiated the governance of the Seven Kingdoms. I had help. You always say that. It's always true. Robb shook his head. He reached across and gripped Jon's arm in the way they had been gripping each other's arms since they were boys, the stark way of saying the things that didn't fit in words. Jon gripped back. Spring, Robb said. Winterfell, you, me, Sansa, and Arya, if we can find her. Arya finds you. Jon said, You never find Arya. Spring, then. Spring, Jon agreed. They separated at the ford, Robb south toward Riverrun, Jon north toward home. He did not look back. He had learned young that looking back was its own kind of cost, and he had paid enough costs this year. Rhaegar found him 2 miles north of the Trident, descending from somewhere high and cold with the easy grace of a creature in its element. The dragon settled into a low glide above the road, close enough that Jon could see the healed seam on the wing, a scar permanent, the kind of damage that knits but doesn't disappear. It would always be there. It had not stopped him flying. Jon tilted his head up at the dragon. Rhaegar looked back. They regarded each other with the wordless understanding they had been building since Meereen, the grammar of a language that had no words in it. Jon rode north. Rhaegar followed overhead, unhurried, reading the thermals, bronze green against the clear, cold sky. They were going home. Winterfell, the godswood, the weirwood sapling was small. This was appropriate. It was also the only weirwood sapling in Winterfell, a fact Jon had discovered by asking every groundskeeper, gardener, and castle servant who had anything to do with the godswood, all of whom had confirmed that weirwood trees did not propagate easily, did not like being moved, and took decades to grow, which Luwin had once described as the tree's way of pointing out that it was more committed to the long term than most people. He had found this one at the base of the ancient heart tree, a volunteer growth that had come up in the last season, perhaps encouraged by the autumn rains. It was 8 inches tall. It had the beginnings of the distinctive pale bark, and its 3 leaves were already the deep red of the weirwood, which the groundskeeper had said was unusual and possibly significant, and which Jon chose to interpret as the heart tree's opinion that this was a reasonable idea. He dug the hole himself. This was not an act of false humility. He simply did not want help with this particular thing. It was a small job, not physically demanding, and it was his to do. The godswood was empty in the late afternoon. The ancient trees stood in their silence, the heart tree watching with its carved face, the red leaves moving slightly in a wind Jon couldn't feel at ground level. He had always found the godswood peaceful, even when he was a boy and the world outside it was complicated. It was one of those places that remained consistent. It had been here before Winterfell and would likely be here after it, and it took the same view of kings and lords and wars and secrets that it took of weather, present, noted, ultimately beside the point. He set the sapling in the hole. He packed the earth around it carefully. He poured water from the skin he'd brought because saplings needed water and he was not going to skimp on the basics. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at it. Ghost, he said. The godswood did not answer. Trees did not answer. Wolves that were gone did not answer. He knew all of this and said the name anyway because some things were worth saying to the empty air. I thought about what to do for a long time. A stone marker felt wrong. You were never really a stone marker kind of wolf. You were a living thing. You always were, even when you weren't moving. He looked at the sapling. Weirwoods take 100 years to be properly themselves. By the time this one has a face, it'll be looking at people who were never born yet, which seems right. You always seemed like you were from somewhere deeper in the timeline than the rest of us. A bird moved in the branches above him. A leaf came down. I kept the promise, Jon said. The one I made in the yard that night in the neck, I said I'd be worth what it cost. I don't know if I managed it. I think the world is, I think it's better than it was. Not perfect, not fixed, but better and building. And the people who built it with me are still here mostly, which is more than I ever let myself hope for. He was quiet for a moment. Ned would have liked you, he said. He'd have pretended not to find you alarming. He'd have given you that look he gave things he approved of without wanting to say so. You know the one. He did know the one. He had spent 17 years cataloging the looks of Eddard Stark, and the one he meant was a specific slight softening around the eyes that Ned deployed for things he found genuinely good and did not wish to make a fuss about. Ghost had received it once or twice in the early years. Jon remembered. He stood up, brushed the soil off his knees. The godswood was still. The ancient heart tree watched. The sapling stood its 8 inches in the afternoon light, pale-barked and red-leaved and entirely unimpressed by its own significance. Jon looked at it for a long moment. Thought about everything it would outlive, himself and Robb and Sansa and Arya, and Daenerys on her throne in the south, and the great council that was currently having its first extremely contentious meeting about the rules of its own existence and all of it. This tree would still be here. It would grow its face and watch the godswood through seasons none of them would see. Good. There should be something here that remembered. He walked out of the godswood into the late afternoon of Winterfell. The yard was its normal, organized noise, servants crossing, a rider coming in from the south, someone doing something inadvisable with a hay cart. The walls were the same gray stone they had always been. The smell was pine and horse and cold air and the specific mineral quality of northern winter approaching. Rhaegar was on the eastern tower, because Rhaegar had decided the eastern tower was his and nobody had successfully argued otherwise. He watched Jon cross the yard with one bright eye the way he did, the specific look that had nothing in it of the worshipful, just acknowledgement. You are there, I am here, we're connected. This is simply how things are. Jon raised a hand at the dragon. Rhaegar looked at the hand and at Jon, and then looked away at the horizon in the direction that probably meant he was thinking about flying later. Arya appeared from somewhere she had not been a moment ago, which was how Arya always appeared and which Jon had never once managed to predict. You planted the tree, she said. Yes, it's very small. It'll grow. She stood beside him and they looked at the castle together, at the repairs still underway on the eastern wall, at the smoke from the kitchens, at Rhaegar enormous and bronze against the deepening blue of the sky. Are you all right? She asked. Getting there, he said. Ask me in the spring. That's what you told Robb. It's still true. Arya looked at him with the sideways look she'd always had, the one that saw more than you'd meant to show. You did well, she said, not dramatically, not ceremonially. Just I noticed and I'm telling you because you're my brother and sometimes brothers need to be told the true thing plainly. We did well, Jon said. She made a sound that was not quite agreement. I killed the Night King. You did, you slowed him down. I did. I'm just saying I know. You're always just saying. He looked at her. Thank you for that and everything else. Arya looked at him the way she used to look at him when they were children, and he'd said something that was correct but that she didn't want to make too much of. She elbowed him in the arm, which was the Arya Stark version of a heartfelt embrace, and walked away. He watched her go. He looked at the castle. He thought about his father, who had played a harp so beautifully that people wept, who had believed in a song, a great prophetic song, the song of ice and fire, the story of the prince that was promised in the battle at the end of the world, and the meaning of it all. He thought. The song was real. The long night came. The prince was the prince was the people who showed up. The prince was Arya with a knife. The prince was Robb in the field for a year. The prince was Davos and his improbable optimism. The prince was 10,000 soldiers who held the line in the dark and were not named in any prophecy, he thought. Rhaegar got the song right and the singer wrong. The wind came off the moors, cold and familiar. The first stars appeared sharp above the walls of Winterfell. In the godswood behind him, a small weirwood sapling stood in the early dark and began, very patiently, the long business of becoming a tree. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, stood in the yard of his home and breathed in the cold and was, completely and without qualification, exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not know what came next. That was fine. He had never needed to know what came next. He had needed to be ready and honest and present and willing to show up. He was all of those things. The rest would come when it came. He went inside where it was warm.